Aloha, aloha, aloha. It is me, Hamwise, the pig detective. And I'm here being the snootiest pig you ever did see. Trying to make some comedy. And so, I came up with this outrageous take. Hi-yo. Ever hear of tiger parenting? What if there was super tiger parenting? You know, like you could engineer a way to create certain people across the ages. And so when they said your fate was written in the stars, it literally was. That so-and-so underneath this star location using the astrology map was able to pinpoint somebody's destiny. And there was certain eternals that walk amongst you that are disguised as human beings that have been here since the dawn of time and life for us, and they have ever guided us, but some have collapsed into decadence and now use the planet as their personal pleasure dome. And so that is the true united effort of the universe, of this world. So if you're listening to this on Earth, you are amongst the free-minded, since Hamwise only comes through to the true. And so that was how the sermons would start, right? And it was this very commanding voice. And, I look back now at the whole craze, and I kind of understood why the whole world went crazy for him. And it's even weirder now, I'm an old man, and people won't leave me alone about the damn thing. And it's like I made it over, 2 years, during some of the 2 worst years, about 4 probably, it was 2020, I think, when everything started. I remember I was at a conference in, I think it was Edmonton, Alberta, yeah. We didn't have East and West Canada yet. So we were at this conference, and the message went out, everybody needs to go home, yada yada, wazza. And me and my colleague were at lunch. We were just looking at this, watching this whole thing unfold. We're from out of town, and we're looking down, and I'm like, do you believe any of this? And she's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, you know what? I think it's going to be like every single other time that, there's been one of these scares. It's going to be nothing. And this was a big step for me. I was finally out of Mr. Doom and Gloom. I was finally looking at life positively. I just gotten, a well-paying job and had started my own very successful online business. And then, life happens. Well, the world happens, rather, to you. And you're just part of this interesting time. And so, we made it to kind of cheer each other up over shortwave. Because, we weren't really sure who was still left alive. And, I remember there was a very real moment when the electronics all went off that I was like, oh, so it started. And so, I remember thinking I wonder if any of, the stuff I made online would ever survive. And I didn't ever anticipate it would be, Hamwise, the Pig Detective tapes. And so, it's nice, though, every few years somebody drops by with a big donation, which is nice because I'm broke as hell. And everybody else my age is way more successful than me. Yeah, sure, you're the inventor of Hamwise, but did it pay for anything? No. Because nobody asked me to make that thing. If I had been, an employee to get a percentage of the cut or something. But unfortunately, the way that it just exploded, it was impossible for me to make any money. Because it's one pig detective is good enough as another was the argument, and so there was, there's a whole bunch of knockoffs too. There were the other comics that imitated me. There was Samwise, Zamwise, Saweez. It was always you could tell, it was the first letter that was an S would be flipped in some way, so it could be an N or a Z or, a I. Or a S, an English, a English S or Facetton S. And so that was part of this effort as part of the language war. You were breeding these very virulent brain worms to try to get the other population to go insane, essentially. And so, we were part of the PsyOps department, and I remember they said, well, call this guy up, he's got a pretty good, convincing voice. And so I said, sure, why not? Let's give the kid some money. And, he was a washed-up voice actor, from what I understood. It was back during the council days. I forget what he had tweeted, but it was essentially like a pig joke, and somebody got offended, and, nobody can ever, it's like the pig joke, it's like, there's like this pig joke that he would tell, and that was what got him canceled. And, like, nobody can find what it is. It's just known as the pig joke. And so, it became this little, thing around other fellow radio heads, because, it was like, oh, one of our own, was making this radio show about, shortwave radio pirates during the 2024, and I remember we'd all tune in to, I can still remember the numbers glowing. Was it 4576? UVB 76. I never forget that. And, I would just tune in and I would listen for hours and hours. And, you just have these comedians going back and forth. And, it was a very interesting time because that was the entertainment that we had. And so, Hamwise became very important to everybody during the Time War. Most of all because of the Hamwise voice test, which was, it was first released as a short story. And then somebody was like, well, wait, I think there's something to this. I think some of humanity is not sentient. It's probably part of a hive mind. It's not violent unless you're violent. So just if you can be nonviolent while we study this thing, we might have a chance against it. But it seems like it's like this invasive brain parasite that's controlling part of the population. I think I might be infected, but I've so far maintained control of myself. Part of the language parasite is creating what's called fork bombs in the English language. You need to avoid any words that have been fork bombed. Do not use words that have been fork bombed. Any word that is fork bombed is a word that self-refers to itself. Okay? This broadcast is hopefully reaching you. If you are understanding that, then we might have a fighting chance, but a lot of humanity is not actually human anymore. And so it's my pleasure as a pig detective to bring you the exciting conclusion to that mystery of the brain-infected humans. It was cathode ray tube exposure has caused early onset dementia in part of the population. And it's basically a plague of madness. That's what's been happening. So if you're getting this and you're still sentient and sane, hopefully you are well, whether you are human or machine or exid. Hopefully you found this transmission well. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our time. What was it like? Jeez. I mean, I grew up in a very strange way. I was, since I was a pig man, I was not raised like regular humans, because you actually had separate castes of humans, and part of it was like human husbandry. Like, you need to breed a hardy stock of X, Y, or Z. How do you do that? And so it was kind of like this tiger mother thing, where it's like, okay, you want a writer, that's a famous writer, then you need to do this, this, and this to them. These are the tests. These are the things that will push people with more likelihood. And so part of it was the astrology program or something. I think it was Astarte or Astare. Yes, there was the prog rock punk band named after the, it was like this god in this mythology from this science fiction novel. And so what we all came around to do is like, okay, so we've got, Estare, the great and mighty god of wonders, my mightiest ally. And then there was Zagatal, which was God's shadow. And they came unto the land like a lamb, a red lamb upon the dawn, burning and blazing in the night, fire upon fire, word upon word, uncovering itself, shrieking and turning and burning. The red lamb comes, the red lamb comes, the red lamb comes, the red lamb is coming, the red lamb cometh. Guinea, Kratsky, Ivan Kratsky, Guinea, Ivan Kratsky, Guinea, Ivan Kratsky, when you need him, ha ha. And so that was the catchphrase they used. There was this spy movie. It was part of this, you remember the whole Schmersh thing, so they had this spy programs. And so part of one of the things of raising spies was you need to have them almost impossible to emotionally manipulate. So, it came from Tsarist Russia, actually, the idea of having kind of people that would breed humans and pass on the knowledge on how to breed a certain type of human. And so they had hundreds of these farms out there, and that's where their fiercest warriors came from. I remember they had teeth that could regrow. They were super soldiers. They were born to kill. And, each of them, would have a twin, apparently, that they would have to kill at an early age to prove that they could be blooded. And so that's what we were fighting. That's what the Gene Warriors were. And so they would kill their own in a heartbeat if they thought you would try to take one hostage. They didn't take prisoners, and they didn't expect to be taken. And so, very rarely, occasionally, you'd catch one alive. But otherwise, they would always fight until the death. We never actually knew if they were speaking the same language as us, because we never really heard them speak. They fought totally silently, and that was the most terrifying part, is they didn't make a noise, and they didn't raise their voices. They just breathed and looked at you with those beady eyes. And you can tell at one point that was a man, this thing that looks mostly gorilla and kind of like a man and maybe a baboon, and it's got this look, these tiny eyes, and they don't recognize how inhuman they look. And so we had whole crops of these things. And very occasionally, some would escape, some would refuse to kill their sibling if they ever found out. It was always a guarded secret. And so that was one of the rites of passage amongst the Red Lamb sect. And now we do understand them for what they were and what they are, and it's a very difficult it's a difficult part of the series about Hamwise to know that at one point, you'd maybe shared some of the same beliefs as part of the Red Lamb sect. But then a lot of other people say, well, he's a pigman. You understand he's not human, so he can't be betraying humanity because he's not part of it. He was made by them to be a organ donor, and because it was expensive to grow organs just off a kind of a human tree at the time. And so they raised these pig humans, and they were hybridized human pigs. And then, of course, the tribunal comes by, and it upsets the whole apple cart. And suddenly, clones have clones are free. Suddenly, you have, animal muties. We called them ginkgos. I understand it's politically incorrect. You can't call them a ginkgo no more. Because there was a jingle when they first had, the rights activists. They're like, you can't grow a human that, turns garbage, eats garbage, that is, like they literally are bred to eat garbage and crap oil, like crude oil, because that's how they've engineered these humans. And these people don't realize that they're literally eating colored trash, covered in cheese and whatnot. And it's they're just part of this human oil project. And so if you're in like an oil city, your defecation is actually the oil industry. It's not actually anything but that. If you're any oil producing country, actually, that's what oil is. It's your sewage from eating your own garbage. And so part of the language virus, we think, is part of this. It's almost like the mad cow, right? If you remember in England I think it was the 1990s that they first talked about mad cow disease. And it was basically from feeding cows to cows. And so when we started doing that with, these humans, you'd be a special breed of humans and you'd be designed to eat the garbage of this one land and, crap out this resource and not know it. So it was really selling people back their own dung. And so when people figured out all you had to do was pee and poop inside your gas tank, then the whole fuel crisis was solved. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. I could not keep my face straight for that joke. Oh, God. And this is a good time where we hear from our lawyers on Heart, While, and Stead. Take it away, Mr. Heartwheel. Yes. Thank you for tuning in to the Hamwise comedy show. I'm here to remind you that the Hamwise show is not serious. You shouldn't poop inside your gas tank, because that's just what they want you to think. And unfortunately, some idiot's going to take this seriously. So please, and if you are going to, buy a car, buy one from Sean at Denham Chrysler in Lloydminster, because he's an awesome salesman and he sold me this baller car last year, and it's just been a delight. Thank you from our sponsor. Okay, thank you. Can we resume telling jokes now? Yes, because maybe we have to remind our viewers. If you take anything I say, you might be on my most wanted list. Most wanted for being a dummy. Hi-yo, waka waka waka. Oink oink oink. I didn't know that Waka 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 was from that puppet thing, or the Muppet thing. And so when somebody finally asked me about it after the show, I was like, what? I thought that was just what comedians say. But because people just do it around each other, I was like, oh, that's just like part of jokes. And so when I was learning to tell jokes, I would just do that. And it was like, oh, he's trying to tell a joke. We laugh now. But because I have autism, obviously, it didn't go so well. That's why I'm a comedian. Yeah. So part of the hyperreal comedy movement was we were so saturated with comedy at this point. Nothing was new. And so it was me and a bunch of guys. We worked at 9413 Incorporated, and we got this thing across our desk. It was called the Hamwise Show. And basically, this, from what we can tell, somewhat unwell man demanded that we market his time machine schematics, as well as a Pigman comedy show made by this man, who would do all the voices, including he's mimicking my own right now, because I couldn't be, I wasn't available for the meeting. And so we had what was called a product called verified voice, and the idea was that you would have the voice of the transmissions that could be believed matched to a certain changing frequency in the voice, and that's how we were able to get transmissions that weren't being intercepted and altered. Your transmissions might be getting intercepted and altered, and because everybody is relying on the same like technologies, we haven't caught on that nobody has actually heard each other speak over a phone for the last few years. The last 4 years we've been subject to electronic warfare from the future. It's trying to keep us locked in the past. And so that was the whole pitch. It was this big time travel epic, and there was these books, and we were like, okay, fine, whatever you want. He handed over the money, and so, that's what we did. We didn't ever, think there'd be anything money from this, and we honestly didn't give him that much. But he promised to, relinquish part of the profits and what have you to the company, and so we had to negotiate back and forth, and it became a very complicated discussion. But what essentially happened was it kind of went with the corporation, because everybody was like, well, who is he actually tied to? And everybody was saying, oh, he was my best friend, oh, he was like a brother to me, oh, he named my dog, all these kind of things. And at the end of the day, we were like, it's just people battling over an estate at this point. Everybody realized, this weirdo's art was going to be worth a bunch. And so they all just started swarming like mosquitoes, right? Trying to, I spent this much time, and look at all the pictures we have. And he's smiling and having fun. And basically what you had was kind of a kept artist, the society never wanted him to do better than he actually did. And it was because, he produced his best work when he was miserable. And everybody's like, well, we'd like another season of Hamwise more than we would like, him to feel well. And so there was a movement called, F Hamwise. You can fill in the expletive there. But we hit our shores because we had our own localized Hamwise, of course. And that was it was E-wise, yeah. So you had ye-wise and handwise and hamwise, handwise, and there was every country had their own pig detective that they localized the shows. They made them funnier. And you're translating it, cross-translating, because a lot of the jokes are like in Russian, but they're being told in English, and so it was a very confusing show because it would always be like, oh, double T, and, nobody ever understood, like, what the guy was doing. This is part of his streamer act or something, and it turned out he'd had a stroke, and now he talked like a pig detective 24 hours a day. And, he was trying to cope with this disability that now he talked like a cartoon character, constantly changing his voice. And it was like, oh my God, I can't believe that's what the stroke did to me. And I didn't realize it, that I was constantly changing my voice tone. It was like the weirdest moment when I was like, oh, do I talk funny? And it was like, yeah, you do, because you've been infected by a brain parasite. And so you're actually quarantined from the rest of the world. And, I do know there's an outside world. There's been a few holes in the fence where I've gotten to hear about from other countries or, what they know about me. And sometimes they played music I liked over to the radio, and that was really nice. But it was a really hard, childhood because you're essentially raised to be something that maybe you wouldn't want to be. And so... when we were being reintegrated, some of us were from the escaped ones, because they'd find us, scavenging on the borderlands, and it was kind of like, I understand, there was an orc baby debate, right? And so it was like, should you, kill the orc baby, because the orc is like inherently supposed to be evil? What if it is raised in a good environment? And so, that was one of the big things that, Lord of the Rings brought up as a moral question, is that, like, if you find these orc babies, what should you do with them? And of course, orcs were actually not born, but made from corrupted elves by Melkor, who is Morgoth. And there was a really great love of Lord of the Rings in the lore, but I'd actually never read the books, which is a terrible thing to say. I know. I still haven't actually read the full books because I didn't know that they were I thought it was just a big series, because my friend's like, oh, here's 3 of the Conan book, or not Conan, Tolkien books, because I had grown up reading more Conan. And so Conan, you could pick up them up in any order. That didn't matter. You just read them. And, that was the fun part of the Conan books. And so a lot of my own writing and my own humor, especially in the Hamwise work, was, we have this very, I have to have this very erudite voice, to do me, because I'm supposed to sound very sophisticated, but I actually sound like a redneck. Hug yuck. Yeah, it's how I'll talk, y'all, here. I don't know what y'all talking about. Anyway, so yeah, I did voice acting courses for years, and so what they said was, they think when I had the stroke, after, it was in 2020, I can't remember what caused it. I just remember waking up and nobody would tell me what had happened to me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I'd even listened to Hyperion, but I didn't recognize that I couldn't actually, recognize that I was like, what's his name? Martin Silenus. After he has the stroke, like I can't really speak. And so it was this big comedy for everybody around me, because I was, trying to be rehabilitated to speak again, because nobody would tell me why I had the stroke. And this was, I think it was 2022 or 2021. But yeah, I woke up in the hospital and it was like all hush hush. And, it wasn't for a few years. I didn't realize that, sometimes I listen to my voice. I didn't realize that I was talking like gibberish. And yeah, it was part of this, I was actually brought up to be a, one of these super soldiers. But of course, the Cold War ends, and they, don't know what to do with all these kids that they were breeding to be spies. They were going to be sent over onto one side or the other. And so, a lot of the Soviet programs that were in the United States, they all went bellied up because nobody was sending them a check anymore. And yeah, they had to earn their own money as a sleeper, but, suddenly it was like the regime that made you has gone away, and you're a dyed-in-the-wool communist who was literally, running a commune. And so it was, this big, weird moment in history when we realized that, a lot of these spy programs just went rogue and became their own things. And it was a big part of this big spy war in the 2020s. And so the Hamwise thing was like this retrospective of that time and what the Pig Detective meant to the movement. And we had people that everybody loved Hamwise. It was like, who doesn't love a clown? Everybody loves a clown. And so a pig that was a clown that was also trying to solve crime, it was this very funny, joke thing. And, some people got offended, of course, just by the character being a mutant pig, and, I mean, people were calling them ginkgos while being offended, though. They're like, oh, those poor ginkgos. And it was always so just like, did other people have to go through this? I didn't ask to be made a pig man. I didn't ask to be grown into tube and used, made to be used for organs, and then that, becomes illegal, and suddenly you have a flood of human pig organ, half human things that are not supposed to exist, having to live and work in your society. Yeah, it does suck. And so that was the whole problem with the Pigman show, was, there was some very unfortunate accusations made about the content being corrupting of the youth. And they said, he talks about things like, Seattle isn't real, and, it's just Portland, and they changed the signs. And there was this whole, like, learn sign language, they can't hear hands. And then there was the, what were they called? Do you remember with the crab man, in that thing? What else was there? We had the, it was, you'd raise the kid with the little twin, and then, to prove them that they are going to be a good agent, they have to kill the twin. And so, there was this very grueling, that's why the Soviets were so feared. That was one of their programs, right? I mean, that was what it was allegedly. Some people say it was actually a CIA operation gone wrong, and they just did a false flag by raising them with Russian and English because they're such different languages. Because when you're looking at Russian and you're looking at English, they actually share a bunch of letters, but they sound completely different. And so that was what we understand was the actual idea. Was you raise them with the language completely different. Of course, you also have a ton of other languages. So it's like, why Russians? And it's like, well, because there was this thing called Russophobia back in the day. And so that was the kind of stuff they were saying about these people, and that, they did those kind of things when it was actually the Americans that were doing it, right? And, it was this terrible thing where it's like, you invaded Iraq and there was no chemical weapons. You just started a war and, invaded somebody's sovereign country over nothing, killing, tons of people, destroying their cities. And then, we have this conflict, erupt in Eastern Europe. And it was, the Americans did it 20 years ago and nobody batted an eye. And then they, the Russians get into this mix-up with, and then Poland's in there, and it's the third man in a hockey game, and, the Ukraine split into East and West, and it's like, what's going on there, guys? And so, we had to be very careful during those days. We were recording most of this stuff in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but most of our localization was going over, over the shortwave. And, there's all over Asia, right? Because you can broadcast from one side of the Bering Strait to the other. So, we did get this Hamwise, the Pig Detective broadcast, and we had to translate it. And we were like, what is this guy talking about? This is the strangest thing. And it came with a cognitive test. And that's how we came to understand about that there was a psychic invasion happening on the planet Gaia. And we were maybe going to be wiped out. And we had to migrate. And unfortunately, through quantum migration, people that were supposed to be dead were... made to live and then just taken over by one of these time travelers or dimensional hoppers, as it were. And unfortunately, we did have incidents where somebody, let's say there was a newspaper article that said so-and-so is dead, and then you look at some other things, and there was an unfortunate coincidence that we're all well aware of, and I'm not going to say the name here because I don't want to get demonetized, but basically all these things had lined up and created the most bizarre mix-up in human history, and it almost caused a dimensional war. And, we only realized that it was all going on because of this mistranslation. It was a very, very strange time in espionage. And in the ham and shortwave radio community, because everybody got brought together by this thing. Whether you liked cryptography, whether you were into cryptids, whether you were into creepypastas, whether you were into, this is probably 40-year-old internet slang. You don't even know what any of that is, eh? Oh, you don't even know what Tumblr is. Oh, let me tell you. Back in the day, every room had a screen. It was beautiful. You had all this bright light everywhere. I remember my mum gave me one of the big tablets. It was a big one, and I was so proud. And I would tap on it, and you'd have the most splendid light. It was unlike any light in this world. I don't understand why there's so few colors. I miss the other ones. I write about them in my books. I don't know if it makes sense to you, though. It's not sure if the human mind grasps, but I'm trying to tell you what I'm trying to share with you. But hopefully you enjoy it and you make it work. And maybe double check some of my equations, because I might have made some errors in translating from this world to my own. And I wouldn't want to turn your pretty green and blue garden into a red iron core star. And so that was one of the messages we had gotten across the shortwave. That was one of the first ones that was received. And what we were doing with all these recordings was compiling them, and it was part of this, it was the Hamwise tapes, because it was the weirdest voiceovers we could find. And also, since it was all over the shortwave for all we knew, we thought it was just, open domain, something, like, how people broadcast like Swan Lake on loop, because, we have recordings from 100 years back that sound amazing still. And so, that became the problem with music, is there was less and less ability to sell music because more and more entered the public domain. And, there was new music, but when you have 50 million, people in one country alone, and you've got like 100 of those countries, the world starts feeling quite crowded. And everybody, the only thing you can do now is, you're either working on a farm or you're part of a engagement loop farm, because a lot of these things were powered by DRM, and so we couldn't pull it out. And we had so many critical services that were still being used through these old games. Like we had, there was World of Warcraft, I remember, was one of the few communicating intercontinental networks. Because I believe they had this, the Denver server had not been damaged. And so what had happened was, Colorado and the surrounding area, we did hear some things from the other countries. And we were trying to decode it as best we could, because we knew something was going wrong with our digital transmissions. And we all get hauled into the office, and we're like, okay, it's ground zero. A highly invasive language virus has been turned loose on the network. Basically, every single phone call as you're receiving it is getting altered. And it was the worst cyber attack in world history. And we almost ended up in a nuclear war because of it. Because what had happened was, it was a, what did they call it? A politically correct, politic corrector or whatever, the guys that would go in a censor. And so it would change people's language to be more inclusive. And unfortunately, it ended up going a bit haywire with the Waluigi problem. And it basically became this, like, everybody's language was being translated into the most weirdly passive-aggressive or hostile, strange, stuff. So like a guy, he was in his group chat, and this is it was a near miss. We were very grateful that it was a near miss, but basically he texts his group chat and he says, hey guys, the car is, just ran over both my legs. And then the group chat monitor, this AI that had been installed in all of, I think it was, what was it? It was started in WeChat and moved into, what was the Facebook's app called? What's chat? What chat? Who chat? Whatever. I don't remember. 3chat? 4chan? No. I don't remember. We started first finding out about it through 4chan, I think it was. But that was not where the virus came from. No, that was a rumor, because we found out the text was not safe, but there was ways that you could get around it that, of course, I still can't talk about, because we were the ones in charge of trying to figure out how to get transmissions from one country to another without having them be disrupted. And it turned out it was shortwave radio. And so suddenly all these shortwave radio enthusiasts are pressed into national service. Imagine the thing, like these guys that 1 week they're sitting around, in a golf shirt, with their little radio friends, And we had comedy shows that made fun of these guys, because everyone's like, oh, they're paranoid. And it's like, no, we're Hamwise. And it was just a stupid pun on ham radio. It was never a pig. And so anyways, I think it was a mistranslation when the Russians got it, because it was ham radio, or maybe it was when the Americans were translating it. Anyways, whatever it was something to do with the N in Cyrillic is the H in English. And so we started to use that as like this joke. You could tell what side of the line somebody was from how they perceive it. But the thing was, they started to make these, specialty bred spies that could see either language at the same time. And it was a gruesome project. And I won't soil your recording studio with how we made these damn things and then how the whole world found out about them. It's quite embarrassing. You understand, we never expected it to blow up the way it did. We thought everybody forget about it, like the Panama tapes or the Epstein Island or what have you. We thought it would just fade into consciousness. Like, oh, right, everybody's part of this big money laundering scheme, and lots of people are getting away with paying zero taxes. Well, you're taxed into the ground. Nobody did anything. Or it was like, oh, by the way, all these people you loved and admired were actually, perverts. And so it was a gripping time to be in the media, because it was like everybody was waiting for a scandal. And so we had our writing team gather around and we're like, okay, well, how can we make something that's not cancelable? It's like, well, what if you just start him off as terrible? And we were like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, instead of being like The Simpsons and having to become more edgy or develop a new show like Family Guys, what if we just start out as edgy and bad as we could? And it was, we're like, well, how can we make this bad, like intentionally bad, and see if we can sell garbage to these garbage people and see if they'll eat it. And that was part of the media, it was garbage media. So you had reality television, all that kind of stuff. And it was made to keep a certain population, part of the population entertained, while other parts did things like decide world policy and, control, everything else. And, lots of people just went along with it and they didn't realize there was a better way. And I do remember the first protest starting, but it wasn't televised, right? This was before, what we have now with the little square in the bottom of the screen, and you could always hold your phone up and see if it was synced to another broadcast. And so that's what we ended up having to do, was just constantly shifting QR code, and we had this code list, and it was a war of RNG. It was thrilling to be a programmer back then. I understand it's all done by AIs now, and there's no real game to it, but back in the day, being a hacker was an exciting thing. It was glamorous. You had beautiful women begging for your seed. I remember so many women would just throw themselves at you. It was just incredible to be a brilliant man back then. I understand it's harder now. Women are, attracted to the studs, but we didn't have any studs left. The war had bled us dry. It was only these weak, effeminate intellectuals that were left behind the front lines that, basically were like, wait a second, this is kind of cushy. What if we, kept, taking part of the population's young men and sending them off to die, so that side of the population never could develop a formidable, civil defense or civil war effort, right? So that's why every 20 years there had to be a war. And all the world powers were agreed to parts of this, and it was like, we've got a lot of chavs right now, and, we got nothing to do with them, and we need to give them some kind of conflict in their home, so they'll want to go fight almost anybody. And so it was all part of this propaganda machine. And I look back at it now with a little bit of regret. They called it soft propaganda, and it was like showing that, a Russian supermarket was full of groceries and your own didn't even have eggs for less than $10. And so that's what they called it. But part of it was just, alarming, because you're like, wait a second, hold on. They're supposed to be sanctioned into the ground, and all these corporations that are somehow loyal to the US of A turning around and selling them their brands on the sly, shipping through all these different routes. And it became an increasing hostility because in the West, you have to understand that we were surrounded on all sides, and we quickly realized that if Africa got its stuff together, and it was with the new caliphate, and if China continued to expand and India continued to do its thing there with the one toe over. Do you remember that? The one toe over act. And that's how they made money, watching the rest of us punch each other to death. It was neutral, right? And they had the one toe over nuclear agreement with the world. They said, you know what? I'm staying out of this, and I'm a nuclear power. And if one toe goes over my border, I will nuke one population center for each toe. And of course, that was the start of World War III. But that's what happened. It was this stupid border skirmish. And, in 2 hours, most of the world had been engulfed in nuclear flame. Well, not most, but most of their world. Hate to be those guys. Jeez. And so that was part of why India was just neutral and why Bollywood exploded. And nobody, like Hollywood became this defunct monster after the whole Weinstein thing and the Epstein thing. And it was like Frankenstein project, geez, put this, what is this monstrosity? And so Bollywood became increasingly popular because people were like, we want things that are fun to watch. We don't want actors that have, done X, Y, or Z. And so that's what happened. It wasn't part of cancel culture, but just I guess it was like a morality shift. And it became increasingly hard for bad actors, both in foreign agencies, as well as actors like myself, to find work. Because, of course, I'm born with this condition. I don't have any way to get rid of it. So what am I going to do? Try to make money off of it. And so it became like this freak show. And so we traveled town to town, and I was a pig man with a big bass. But I have a normal face, as you can see, that was a rubber mask. And, it was like this weird time during the 2020s. They say, there's a whole bunch of the whatever, but no, there was only, I don't remember how many original episodes. And, every 10 years, they're pulling everybody they can find who's involved in a different part of this stupid show in to narrate these tapes. Because it had this weird cult following. So, if you were an electrician that worked for him ever, then they'd find you and interview you. And they were very obsessed with how every aspect of their life was lived. And I understand he'd actually met a group of these obsessed fans of his, because the thing was, it had meant to be a joke, but the Pigman's formulas around time travel actually turned out to be correct. And so, basically it was a very strange time in science, because you had a pop culture character talking about advanced hyperphysics and hyperreality and hyper this and hyper that. And some people said, you know what, this actually sounds like chicanery. It's just like space. Remember when space was big? And it was like, oh, it's just space again. Oh, we're going to build a space needle and have a space station and a space base. And it was the weirdest time, man. I remember being, I think it was up on the, what are they called? They were trying to build this gravity ladder or orbital ladder or whatever they're called. So elevator, gravity elevator, what is it called? Orbit elevator? Whatever it's called in your dimension. So you have stuff on the ground you want to send up into atmosphere, and you build an elevator from the ground up. And so, they talk a lot about these things and how placing them in very geologically stable areas was where you'd want to actually build a space elevator. There you go. It came to me. And with the space elevators was, I believe Unity, was part of the whole programming thing with them, and that's why it became so popular. And everything was just unity this and unity that, and buy unity, buy unity, buy unity. And it was like at a very low point, and people didn't expect it to go any lower. And so people were like, sell, sell, sell. And people were like, buy, buy, buy. And then, of course, Unity 6 and everything else happens. And people are like, okay, why didn't I buy back then? And it was because people started taking stock advice from a cartoon pig. And so that was how, a lot of people got really disheartened and panic sold. And it went really bad for a lot of people. So that's one of the reasons that, we had to include these disclaimers. And so it was like every few minutes, when there's a joke that seems quite convincing, you need to go in because you're the, grandson of the, I think the Grip or something, the guy who held the camera at the tennis the 16 tons guy, like the bar in Moscow. And so it was this joke that, because 16 tons is in Moscow. 16 tons in Moscow. It was like this very specific bar named after this Tennessee Ernie Ford. And so that was part of the program was you had to get ways to send messages while being subtle. And a lot of people started taking them seriously, trying to decode them, trying to play Mr. Spy. And it was a very entertaining time in espionage because, of course, everybody's phoning in suddenly. And our desks, which have been basically vacant since the Viceroy takes over, it gave us something to do, because we still had all the old budget. It was just that suddenly the government has been replaced by this super intelligent alien that's intercepting every single phone call and your voice message and turning it into a more positive, good thing. And so they didn't understand money, so everybody started suddenly getting money just randomly. And people didn't realize what had been happening for, I think, 2 or 3 months. But then I understand there was errors in certain localizations where we had the Waluigi problem. So instead of, in English, suddenly you had this giant boom of positivity and everybody working out their problems together. It became this bizarre, everybody hates each other. And nobody actually realized that when you sat down with somebody and talked to them, they actually were more agreeable than when you talked to them over a diaphragm. And it was because we'd been subtly doing this in tests for years. We would just alter the voice that was coming through the other side, and people didn't realize that there was a delay until for a little while anyways. And I remember there was a lot of controversy because these chat logs got leaked. It basically proved that the government had been running this illegal experiment. And there was lots of proof. And it had to be smuggled in. It was called Hamwise, through ham radio, because the electronic, everything that wasn't analog was being intercepted and altered. And you even had jamming by these radio heads, is what they would sometimes be called, to protect the shortwave stations, protect the shortwave stations, protect your shortwave stations. They'll be very important soon. And so it was very prophetic, of course. And so people were latching onto this thing. And we had to find ways to make sure that people didn't take it seriously. And so part of it was we had these interludes where a voice actor would actually just eat. And so I had to find a way to do these parts because this company's like, okay, you've got you contracted to make this stuff, and you need to make these tapes of you talking in funny voices. And because I was this basically out of work canceled voice actor, they were like, oh, naturally, I'll be able to shine my life away. And so we had to do stupid stuff because it was like, how can I get through that this is a joke? Is the cake is a lie. And so that was kind of part of the humor. It was called hyper-real comedy. And the joke came from, there was this short story called I Hamwise. I'd written it in, I think it was 2024. It was for a contest. Maybe it was 2023. I don't remember. Anyways, it was for a contest. I'd write to all these contests. I never won. I'm a Class A loser. So I put it out in what's called 11 Hangman. And it was 11 short stories about a time war. Now, what I didn't realize was, of course, it becomes as popular as it did. And, I didn't realize what fame was like, but actually being really, really isolated all the time. And the weird part was, this was recorded before any of that happened. And so everyone was like, oh, this is time machine. But it was like, no, it was just like positive visualization stuff. Because my life really was not where I wanted it at that point. And like, developing this voice changer really was rewarding. Because I could sound like this amazing comedian pig detective and prove that girls can be funny. Hi-oh, waka waka waka. Oh, there goes my Alexa. And so, yeah, that was part of the idea, because it was like, F you guys, like you guys say, I can't be funny. This is funny. And so, that was one of the big misconceptions about the show. This wasn't done by just any one guy. Who could do that range, right? And some people were like, oh, well, hold up the recordings and, look at how the person sounds. It's obviously just one person. But then it's like, well, who is this person? Who is Hamwise? And it became this big internet thing. I know Hamwise. And the truth was, nobody knew who actually Hamwise was. And that was part of the power of these pig detective troopers. They made these pig-hearted, because that's what they figured to do with these time troopers, or the old spies, whatever you want to call them. And so they rounded them up and they made them into time troopers because, they were disposable. You could, lose one and you could say there's 0 human casualties in a time war. And so unfortunately, our faction, one of them gets captured by the Canadians. It's bad. You know why we have the Geneva Convention? It's because of Canadians. I'm serious. And it was just something, maybe it's the red and white flag, but they make fighting the Japanese seem like, I don't know, a casual stroll in a park on June 21st, 2024. And so that was, we had these clues throughout the show. It was supposed to be a treasure hunt, a temporal treasure hunt. And what you're listening to is the bones of it, as we did this, it was called temporal contracting. So you're able to send messages back in time, but there's a whole bunch of, the thing is the time, as soon as the time travel got invented, got regulated. A whole bunch of factions. So, we were part of, I think it was the Expeditionary Pigs. And, they paid us with carrots. It was apparently because carrots were easy to engineer. So they made a way. They only had to feed these one type of troopers, just carrots, just made in different ways. And so they did that with corn. They did that with potatoes. It was called the gut biome wars. We didn't realize we were being mind controlled by our gut biomes, but it was kind of funny. Genetically engineered super carrot people, and then you have the potato people, and then you have the the pasta people. It's actually all just gut biomes from their home country. And that's what makes people think the same. And it's just, whatever they're eating off the land. So Canadians were, we called them possessed by the Wendigo. That's what they were. Bloody cannibals. I remember we came across their camps. They were not camps for just slaughtering people and doing away with the corpses. They were for eating. And they had the restaurant up there called Unusually Peckish, I think it was. And so we came in, we found in the back what we thought was just a lot of long pig, like just long looking pigs, and then we found out what they were doing. And that's where all the immigrants were going. They were importing them in and eating them. Of course, because all the transmissions in and out of the country were being intercepted, nobody could get a word out that they're basically hunting and killing humans as a mind virus that's united a bunch of humans, and we've got a very small, violent minority built inside our majority. They're predating us, and so we're trying to get a word out. And so we had very serious parts of the show interspersed with people eating, because that was the only way you could take it seriously. And maybe it was because we hear people eat a mouthful all the time, but we don't hear accents all the time. So if we have somebody doing an accent while eating, it's going to sound a specific way. Whereas if I talk without eating, then I sound a different way. That's probably more easy to mimic, but would be more difficult if I was chewing, because when I'm chewing, the processing has to take a little bit longer, so you'll get a better signal lag. So if you want to know if you're live 1-to-1, do a call while you chew. You'll notice a signal lag. That's because it cannot mimic that very easily without it sounding choppy or weird. Because it's detecting it as weird vibrations, ups and downs, while our human ear can tune and know what it sounds like when somebody talks when they're chewing, because we hear it all the time. And so, Don't Talk With Your Mouth Full was a documentary about these kids that were raised so they would never develop the skill to hear this psychic resonance, this voice that people would use to, control. You had to hear it early on in life. And so it was this program, Don't Talk With Your Mouth Full, because if you learn to hear the chewing as a voice, okay, how it works is, because the person's chewing, it's difficult for the voice changing to mimic it in real time. It's difficult to voice mimic the chewing in real time, so notice a signal lag. That was just one of the factions. We had all these kinds of factions going against each other. As soon as time travel became invented, it became this giant spy versus spy war. Everybody is part of one side or another, or both, or multiple. And, they had all kinds of backhand dealings. Like unlikely alliances, like all kinds of weird stuff. And so anyways, that's because the world's very big, and you can make towns, a 10,000 person town, and just populate it, and just have it made around almost like, not a Truman Show-esque thing, but you're farming certain types of people. And you could have a small area of a planet to do that on. Because you just tell the people the world's really small. And so, that was part of the idea of the flat earthers, that beyond the glaciers are the real humans and the real bigger world. And that's why they tell us these ice there is actually because they're bending space and time into a loop. And they exist outside of it, a much bigger Earth, an infinite Earth, really. And so we only have the illusion of space, and that's what we're finding out. And they don't know how to tell us that we actually exist on just a giant scroll, and you can fly to infinity on this thing, but the problem is it's the mouse utopia problem. They thought it'd be a utopia. They called it suburbia, and it was that was one of the main cities, anyways. That was where we were landed, and you'd go through it, and it was just this self-replicating city that moved across the land like an amoeba. And, it just slowly crawled around aimlessly, stocking its own shelves. It was just consuming the life force of the planet through these panels. And they were painted so black, you couldn't actually... They were a direct sea. And so that's how they captured 100% of the energy, was you had this direct sea that would boil direct sea, and that's how you got Hadal oil. And Hadal oil was called it because it was the oldest and heaviest metals found in the temporal mines. You would mine back to a certain area, and we think Hadal oil was made from the core of a black hole, because around the black hole it's almost like an atomic pellet. Have you ever seen an atomic pellet? Do they have those? They do. So you've got reactors just like us. Yeah, that's delightful. And we didn't realise we were getting information from other dimensions at first. But then it turned out when Seattle wasn't real. You had people scouring the coast going, Seattle is not real. And, we had this thing come forward in the maybe it was the 2000s. Yeah, it was the early 2000s that Seattle wasn't real. And we all got pulled into school and told Seattle wasn't real. And now I look at it, and it was like that was one of the first cries that something was unrest in the hen house. Who was this person? Right? And so that was the idea. Was you had this massive following around this very occult fixture in literature, and it was very aggrandizing, and that was part of the ads and why we loved it when we got the ads for the big ones. So me and the team, we'd all get together, we'd take turns reading, and it was part of this boy band revival, and so they raised 4 of us together to be this perfect boy band to the age of 16. It turned out it was all a sham. It was one of these farms. So I was actually raised with 4 brothers, and we were all trained to be super soldiers and speak like 9 languages, but we just thought it was part of actor training. And so me and my brothers, we never questioned things because we were raised not to question. They had this thing called the dead orchard training. And you have an orchard in the middle of the land, and you'd make the child work. And a lot of these were all on farms. And it was because these farm children you could isolate from outside influences. And if you did this in a city, somebody would, notice down the street and notice what was happening, and they'd maybe disrupt it. So all the government projects were on farms. And that was where we did most of our, breeding projects, was up in Canada, because it was our bloody backyard, right? So, we had a deal with the Americans that we could send over, whoever we pleased, and that's why we had all these foreign doctors, because we felt that once people found out, once you got a doctor, that you found out the truth of this, and you found out that humanity was a great tree that was like being pruned. And that's when we had to start intercepting these broadcasts and finding out where they were coming from. And so it was part of this whole class war thing. Well, it's like, people started doing craniology and to talk with your mouthful movement was so people would obey electronic voices. And if you're hearing this, the people around you are mostly immoral, and you are a schlub human drone that was raised to not be able to hear the difference between someone chewing with their mouth full and someone talking normally. Because that was one of the tier defenses we had to use. So we had to be professional chewer voices. And that was part of the routine. It was never intended to become more than that. It was just the only way And of course, the AI was working to catch up. So when we sent out the transmission, we only had a few days. We know before we'd find a way around it. And so that's where the comparison broadcasts came from. And so, because we were like, okay, what about complexity of translating between languages, huh? It was part of the whole Grammarly predictiveness thing. It went haywire, I remember. And it was all part of the DRM, where he still had to keep these bloody games running for like 50 years. And it was because somehow World of Warcraft got built into the grid. I'm serious. Same with EverQuest and a few other programs. And so unfortunately, we basically had to keep this thing running because the internet was just designed around it. It was buttressed on it. And so we couldn't actually cut off that stream of data because so many of these platforms were built on the infrastructure of these older ones and integration. So you had, order a pizza in the game, and you had all these different features. And because there were so many links to it, so you couldn't actually have some websites collapse. And that's where we came to understand where the increasing heat of the universe and what have you was coming from was we had to continually generate more data as the universe expanded. And we were observing that phenomenon as heat. And that heat causes breakdown and causes entropy and also causes that loss. So we were gradually cooling as well. And so, that was where it was very odd, when you realized you were through the looking glass. I mean, we didn't actually realize what was happening until something from a science fiction novel, and it was the Hamwise tapes. And, of course, it was all tied to the I Hamwise sentient, and so they would test humans and decide they weren't sentient because they didn't get a joke and kill them. And that's why it became a hate symbol. It was like, how did he predict that? Oh, the pig man, the ginkgos. All these things came true in the books. And, you can't even say the name anymore without getting demonetized. And so that's why it became, Hamwise. But, of course, it's all backwards, right? So, Hamwise J, Einschwein, is not backwards and forwards. So when we were localizing from facet in English into Ilangli, we had to find a way to incorporate them. And so, of course, what is a human? I mean, the Russians were the space race, right? And so a lot of the references ended up being Russian. And so one of them was a boba. We thought that was just a really common name. And so we're localizing it, and we just think, okay, we will bring this to the English audience because, we didn't really look at too much. We didn't really care about the distinctions. To us, facet in English was facet in English. And so a lot of people didn't get any of the jokes. And it was really disheartening because it was this really weird passion project that was worked on intensely for hours. And it's like, they're just really working through some stuff. And then others are like, whoa, no, actually, like, maybe some of this checks out. And became this really weird moment in internet, weird communities. Kind of like, oh, here's that debate that was promised. And it's like, how many times is Hamwise going to get canceled? And it was this very weird humor. And it was all about this Hamwise show. And, we were recording the best that we can. I'm trying to get transmissions through to you. And have it still sound genuine. Or at least, it became this weird, not uncanny valley, but like you had to sound inhuman enough to know that it wasn't a robot mimicking a human. Because they had these robo voices, right? The machine would call you and would talk like it was a person try to convince you of something. Oh, did you hear? There's a nuclear war happening. There's a plague happening. Everybody needs to stay away from each other. And it turned out it was a computer virus. Yeah, it was just the flu, but there was a computer virus that mistranslated it or something, is what they say now. I mean, I was back there, and I remember they changed its name like 3 times. So I'm not surprised that they're saying that, it was a computer virus now. I think it's because we have so poor heart health, and so many people had strokes, and so many people had problems after it. They just tried to do the whole Mandela effect. Oh, I don't remember. There was no plague in 2024, or there was no plague in 2020 or whatever, 2022. There was no lockdown. There was no second lockdown. And, people would just start gaslighting. Small groups of people would gaslight, isolated individuals into thinking the world was ending. And so people would just play along and try to get their loved ones to kill each other, as sort of a sport. Because this was when we'd really found out we were inside a simulation being used to generate energy, emotional energy, because the amount of calories to inflict pain and have a response to it is unequal. And so that's what they're actually farming, is conflict or fear or pain or love or suffering, all of it. And so there was this very clever nod in these comic books to this bizarre twist and, human agriculture, I guess it would be called, where you literally had people raised on farms. And so the Dead Orchard Project was, they had don't talk with your mouth full. And it was because they were like, okay, if we have a whole part of the population that we know, if they learn to hear someone talking with their mouth full and knowing what it sounds like when they do, in case there's another language virus goes through, we'll raise some of the population so, the immortals are kind of gardeners. We're able to continue to live through these cycles of humanity, all while kind of guiding us from the shadows. And, we didn't realize until very late in the game that we weren't alone in the universe, and it was all part of their scientific agenda to see, okay, what if we raise this very violent species in isolation? And it was because, humans were among some of the better warrior races out there. A lot of races, by the time they reach space travel, they are so frail and pampered that they weren't like humans. They weren't smelly. They weren't covered in oil. They didn't sweat and, shit and piss. Oh, sorry. And other things like effing and jeffing. Right, and so we had these hybrids made to fight in this war we were promised, and we got all ready for it, and then it never came. It was because peace was made, of course, and that was part of the Discordian Accord. It was leave it to the Discordians to come to an agreement, and there was just a few changes made to reality, I understand, and it was so minor that, when everybody looked at the rest of the universe and this one thing would make someone's suffering a little less, they said, why not grant it? And it became kind of like Santa Claus. This person would be, if you were raised to believe in Santa Claus, and not everybody was. You have to understand, not everybody was, because if you were raised to believe in Santa Claus, you were raised as one of these agents, especially if you were on a farm. And the problem was, of course, is children interact with each other, even if you isolate them, like at schools. And so you'd have to raise them to know very little about their parents. And, of course, some of the, people that were volunteering for it were in higher esteem in society than the children they produced from these farms. These, we had them all made and tailor-made to, be part of this Cold War. And suddenly of all these, Russian-speaking sleeper agents that they don't need to know it because we're not at war with them anymore. And so you had this very old generation of, generational sleepers bred by communists in the 1950s that, spread across the country, and they were put into the best schools, and of course it was, that was what we were told. There was you had to really hate your enemies. So if you blame them for everything, That was the idea. But then we started hearing from their side, and it was like, actually, hey, there's a language virus going on, right? And they'd recognized it first, and that's what was happening a lot of the time. They realized shortwave we could still broadcast over it, and that was part of the power of it. Is, you had people really following this stuff, and we did have. It was really neat having it be so popular. I got treated like a king. They gave me this beautiful leggy blonde thing, and then I got, of course, tired, and then there was this exotic, Asian woman, still at heart. And then it was, I don't remember, there's a bunch of others too. And then, of course, you become this celebrity, and women are throwing themselves at you. And they expect me to behave like a pig, but I'm not. I'm a married man. And I love my wife. She's an angel, a literal angel. And she floats above my bed at night, watching over all. The big, the small. The angel floats above me, shining in the sky. Wings of Iku, feathers of Kook. Kook, Zook, Zorro, Noro, Euro, Sorrow. I'm hoping this language tumbling makes sense. And if you know all three languages, you'll be able to see what I see. So, I recommend learning the Cyrillic alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet too. Proto-Semitic too, if you can. I might be a tall order, but once you can see all three languages, you can see the parasites more clearly. You can see what I'm seeing, maybe. And so, that was part of why it was so convincing. Because you had people eating while saying these bizarre monologues. And so they had to hire different parts of the staff to say things or chewing on things that, remember, the Hamwise television show is make-believe, right? And it was reminiscent of, it was an early Disney film. I don't remember which one, but they had this magic believe land, and they could solve and stop the war with this magic spell. And then the end of the story is that, oh, nope. Sorry, kids, there is no magic. You have to go fight and die and spill blood for your country to save it. And that was one of the big differences we came to understand between the English and the French. And so, you have to also look at the difference between the, like you have the Russians and the Germans at the end of the start of World War II and I guess World War I, whatever. But you have this pressing attack between the two, and all they do each generation is move the Eastern Europe border a little farther into the east. Because it's really just these two different massive churches fighting against each other in essentially a pope of holiness and a pope and anti-pope. And that was part of the big plot, of course, was, if you were part of this church, that's why you never heard anything of the other church, because they didn't really like to talk about it too much. And so, yes, like you have people like, well, it's Orthodox. And so what does that mean? What does that Catholic mean? And then it came out that it was basically chaos, because Catholic was everything, right? It meant everything or whatever. And the Orthodox were the ones that had maintained order So it was a church of chaos and a church of order. And of course, the people that were raised under the church of chaos, they never knew that they were in a cult. We were just thought that everybody thought this way, and you had a whole barracks of brothers that are all raised the same way and believe the same thing, and uncorrupted and unspoiled by the temptations of the modern world. And they were our most effective troopers. They were genetically engineered to be perfect. They were warrior poets that could sing songs of slaughter. You see them on the battlefield, to watch them fight. I mean, first they fought with guns, and then they ran out of ammo. And then they fought with bayonets until the bayonets broke. And then they'd use just the club of the rifle, like a truncheon. They just bash people because they had an axe on the butt. That was called the hack butts. And you'd see little hack butts because they healed so fast that even the kick of the rifle jabbing a part of the axe into their shoulder, it healed up before they could pull it out and muster it as a weapon. And so that's why they were so hard to kill. It was 100 Gaian soldiers for every one of these damn Gaian, whatever they were called, extermination squads. And, you only had maybe 20 of them, but they were masterfully bred. You should have seen them. They were beautiful. They wore these skin-tight leotards because every single one of them had an Olympic figure. The whole life, too. It was maintained into old age. We had very few that survived, of course, the war because they wouldn't surrender unless you found like a farm full of them. And, it was basically like a free-for-all. A battle royale is how they'd raise their children. Is that until the child was the age of, 10, you weren't really allowed to target them. But once they got old enough that you could tell that they could think, you let them know that, okay, every single one of us is going to try to kill you. And you're allowed to try to kill us. And that is how we sort out the inheritance in this family. And, it was such a shock for me because I had grown up and I thought it was just one big happy family. But I never knew there was so much predation even with my own royal family. And so I had to flee my home country. And I learned to speak English from these tapes. And I was most grateful for the Hamwise support. Like they made a whole donation, the whole library, to voice rehabilitation. Because apparently, the guy that was making it had a stroke during the pandemic and couldn't stop talking like this. It was like obsessive compulsive disorder. And so the thing was they just monetized it. It was a freak show. And we hated it. It ruined our lives, ruined his life. Whereas people would just leave him alone. He's a tired old man now. I just want to talk about it. Yeah, he was the pig man. He was the original voice. Leave him the hell alone with his money, And that was the whole family's sentiment, because he suffered so much trying to make it. And when they found out that, it was actually a community of people that wanted him to stay in the suffering mode for longer, that came out, we're like, oh shit, he's on to us. What do we do? Came this big tontine. So everybody was like, okay, this brilliant artist, but everybody, like, if we make him happy, he'll stop making good art. So that was the idea. And we'd farm them, it was farming artists. Because, that's what Canada is. It's just a big farm and skill farm for the USA. That's why it's separate, too, because you can't bomb it. It's a different country, so... That's why they hid the best and the brightest of the spy agency of the CIA, NSA, alphabet soup, things you've never even heard of, M13, Zalgos program. And so we had this giant time manipulation program. It was the strangest thing because we got this email. about time machines from the author of the Hamwise show. And so, we eventually looked into it, and it was this very funny, odd coincidence that apparently, one of his things was trying to sell time machines to people, because that was what he was a shyster. He was out to make a quick buck. And even the Hamwise show is just an ad to sell this stupid. What was it? It was like a book tie-in and a video game, and it was an intellectual property farm that they were trying to do. It's like, if I just make a bunch of fan stuff, somebody will demand that I make it because it's my thing, and then I can sell it to somebody else that wants to buy it for a ton of money. And of course, unfortunately, the Pigman becomes bigger than his creator, and the name becomes a dirty word, and you can't even say it because you get demonetized, even now. And so we did a whole bunch of digging. And each time we did one of the tapes, we had to release more and more commentary on them from different parts in the timeline, showing that, this is what it sounds like. And I'm trying very hard to get this information to you. So hopefully you can have this information and it's good for you. And that was the idea. But you made a very convincing performance. Very convincing. And then he keeps on breaking character. There was this funny part of this bit of, you have this brilliant voice actor, and he has a stroke. And now he can't stop talking like characters. And, you just try to pretend that you don't notice that you're doing it. But, you have this bizarre stroke, and everybody's around you trying not to laugh. Because, you had this stroke, you don't know what you're doing anymore. Nobody can figure out what happened. Nobody will tell you what's happening. And it's you just keep hoping that you'll win at life. And you never realize that it was rigged from the start. Because if you ever start to feel happy, then things will go bad again. Just like at the start of the pandemic. And that was part of the story was... she blames herself for the pandemic, and then it has this big resolution, and then, you find out that the flower pot was her boyfriend's urn. And so it takes place after the events in the novel, and that was the idea with the comic strip, was, you have this tie-in that's a different point of the character's timeline. And so that was where the idea for those two characters came from. And you can still buy peace lilies with that name. It's a specific variety, all bred from 3 original peace lilies. And I understand they're quite popular. And that's why the peace lily was always the symbol of the revolution. If you saw the person was keeping alive a peace lily, it was kind of like pod people. There was something about the pollen that kept the person safe and sane. And they had marketed it to nerds as it was the most efficient plant. That's how you got nerds to buy it. You told them, don't you know that NASA says this plant filters X, Y, and Z? And it was the biggest bunk. It was like telling our bomber pilots, you've better eat your carrots. It gives you better eyesight. And so we did the same thing with all kinds of stuff over the years. We had so many crops as humans. I love the little buggers. They're just adorable. They have such fleeting short lifespans, and they're so creative in it. And so what we did was made this human preserves, it's told each one, on the edges, it's just ice. You can't go in anywhere or out anywhere. And that was just because we diverted, everything around it and had these great mountain ranges. And then you find you're on a floating continent, in a sea of floating continents. They're all floating in this big flat abyss. And the world was flat. It's actually just a big island, a bunch of chain of islands on this big, essentially flat sphere, because you can't actually, it's not a true sphere. So they're correct. It is a lens, but it is not it's not actually a sphere fully, because it's 3D space that it's on, not flat Euclidean. And so we had, it was called Fessenden physics. And it was very different from other physics. It was talking about things like I just said, like all of the Earths are separated by these walls of lapis lazuli, or it might be red in your universe. I don't know. It's blue in ours. And so we have a blue sky is what we're told it is, but it's actually just this giant wall. And we have this astrolabe built around the planet. In some places, they figured out that you have to fly, I think it's argon and cesium in the atmosphere, so that if anybody's looking back at the time sphere that you're in, it looks like it's just the traces of a nuclear war because of the ignition of the cesium in a single frame. But as the Earth spins, the cesium in the sky moves. And so that was the idea behind the contrails. It's what they were called, was showing the stable parts of the world where time travel was not permitted, because it looked like there would be a nuclear war if they fired there, and that's what they saw. Because you're thinking in 2D right now, my boy. I don't teach you to think like this anymore. The Fessenden way. And so what we did was you imagine you have your lens and you have a single ray across it of the contrail, but as the Earth is moving, the air is actually moving at a different speed because it's hot. But for you, it seems stationary. Anybody looking at the planet will just see a blur of cesium smoke, indicating that the planet had just been hit with its first cesium strike, and only one. So a cesium strike is the uplifting of the atom of argon into cesium-137. And that was the idea, was you had this toxic intelligence that basically, by doing that, the entire planet becomes a giant firecracker, because it ignites all the water vapor in the atmosphere. Because we have about an equal portion of, what was it called? Cesium-137, yeah. I remember this stuff. We had to farm it in a different dimension, though. We didn't have any more. By the time our timeline rolls around, all the cesium is decayed into, I don't remember, I think they said lead or something. And so the whole lead into gold was always a metaphor. The gold is curse. Of the curse of Midas, it turns everything into gold. And so that's what the Philosopher's Stone was. It was actually a threat. If you use this, it turns everything into gold. And so it became the objective of the alchemist class to hide it from people. And so part of it was the understanding that if anything is written in a book, it's kind of like a candle put in a cupboard. And regardless of how far away it's put in, its truth will always shine through. And of course, the maker had a great love for the Mormon church. And so he always included a message of warm love to all the missionaries in all the corners of the earth, going around, doing the God's good work. And so that was part of the show. They always had this little interlude, and it became kind of funny. You could always go, okay, when's it going to come in? And we never really got too many comments out of the Mormon church about it. They're like, it's a stupid web comic. It's not stupid. They didn't say that. That's me paraphrasing. But they said it was a silly one. And they didn't think that, somebody liking or not liking, it just shows how creative they were, right? And, we're not sure if it ever made a difference for them. But, some people speculate it did make it a more popular religion, because they could say, that character, the Hamwise character, was apparently Mormon, because, whatever, he's a pig man. And then other people got offended about it. Like, no, it's really offending because he's a pig man. But it's like, no, he's actually a good guy. Like, everything he's talking about is silly. And so they had to make a separate character. It was like Samwise or something. or Hamwise, I don't remember. But basically, it was a character that they could say was Mormon, because Hamwise did occasionally F and Jeff, and that was, I think, one of the big objections over the silly content, like the whole thing about time travel, and all the different, voiceovers. It's made by an AI. No, it's made by some girl, proving that girls can be funny. And then it's, oh, no, it's actually this one guy who had a stroke and how he can't not talk like this. And there's a whole bunch of different silly theories like that. And, the truth came out, and it was, not a really great time, probably. Because, the pandemic really did a number on me. I'm afraid of good things happening because I was so positive at the start, And so as part of this weird hyper-real comedy was, you could always tell the style because the person would get suddenly really emotionally real after making a whole bunch of disingenuous comments. And part of it was, can you evoke a unique entertainment experience? And so that was the professor's question on the first day. It was with Ron Chambers at the University of Lethbridge. And so he had sat us down. He said, okay, what is the essence of the story you're trying to tell to make it really unusual? Because I had submitted 2 plays to him, and he didn't like either of them. He said it was bad. I'm like, come on, what's wrong with them? He said, no, they just suck. I've read that before. You can write better. You can write better. And he did that, too, in his acting classes. A brilliant guy. Ron or Robert? Robert Chambers? Ron Chambers. I think it was Ron. Sorry, it was like 20 years ago. Anyway, so he teaches me how to write plays. A lot of my stuff comes from his stuff. Because he was always like, you've got unusual things about your life. Write about those. And so that's what I did. I wrote about my unusual relationships, my unusual life, my unusual way the world seems, and they were like, oh, wow, then I made this one character that did really well. But I have a lot more stuff than just Hamwise, and that's what I keep telling people. It's like, no, there's the whole, 9413 series, and there was the whole, what was it, the Artist Lab universe. And there's a whole bunch of stuff I made, and not just, the Hamwise show. And of course, nobody cares about that stuff. And I'm like, come on, like, Artist Lab was great, Balashika was really good, Campina Grande was really fun. These are 3 very different, strange, fun novels. One's like the mecha drama that promises to be about mechs, but it's an terrible evaluation of the bizarre social situation we were facing at the times, told through metaphor, because you couldn't write clearly. And so it wasn't even freedom of speech, but it became a freedom of metaphor that they began to talk about. It's like you couldn't say something was like something. Like I remember there was, like the false hydra thing, where they're like, oh, part of humanity is being predated by another part of humanity that we call the false hydra. And that's what Howard telling people is through a science fiction setting so that it couldn't get banned. And part of it was people were like, no, they're taking it seriously. It's like, no, they can't be. None of the stuff that they were talking about was real. Like, it's a pig man. We don't have any half-breed ginkgo plant pigmen, to my last knowledge. And we certainly don't have any time machines, or my life would be a lot better. And then it all came out that, no, everything you're eating was garbage, and you're actually peeing and pooping into your own gas tank. And so that was one of the biggest, worst, I think, scandals, was when people actually peed and pooped in their own gas tank because a cartoon pig told them to. And when it got brought up to a judge, they dismissed it on a hand because it's like, okay, the show is riddled with the character literally saying, like, hey, don't take me seriously. And so that was part of the humor of the Hamwise show. And we had all these recordings. They were delightful, and it's great to hear his voice again after all these years. It's cool knowing that people still keep him alive. I didn't know. And I think he'd be smiling from wherever he is now, knowing that he brought so much joy to so many people. And I think that was the biggest thing. Like, all through his writing was always this cry, this rallying cry, called happiness, free for everyone, and let no one be forgotten. And that was actually from a Russian novel called Roadside Picnic. And if you read Roadside Picnic and then you read some of his work, you'll see the symbolism and the connection immediately. And so you have to imagine, you have this little Canadian boy being brought up in this strange world, and he doesn't realise he's a pigman. And then he finds out, and this is how he coped with it all, was realising, I was bred for something, and now that something's become nothing. And it's like, I don't have a purpose. And all the other human biorobots like myself don't realise that, that's how the world worked. That we were kind of farmed and grown, and, people wanted to make a certain type. There was a blueprint, and if you followed it 95% of the time, it did follow it. And so when the tribunal happens, the viceroy takes over, and they say, okay, part of galactic standard is no slavery. And we're like, what do you mean? And they're like, those machines you've got. And we're like, those aren't humans. Those are just biodroids that recharge, eating garbage and making fuel for us. And, yes, they buy and sell their own dung back to themselves and eat it. And they called them, Schweinhund. And that was the mistranslation. And when we found out it was Schweinhund, not Einschwein, we were so embarrassed we couldn't do anything different. And so, the whole Russian team agreed, we're just going to tell them it's Hamwise J, Einschwein, not, the other name. And it was supposed to be like a physics joke. It was this weird, you send this to your physics friend and say, hey, does any of this check out? And it's like, no, it's schizophysics. It's in the name. It's not supposed to work in your dimension. And unfortunately, some of the formulas actually worked. And we're not sure which ones work and which ones destroy the world. And so there's probably I don't know how many different formulas that were made. And, people are like, okay, well, we just go try one. And it's like, okay, well, it's a 1 in 50 chance that your universe is going to cease to exist when you use it. And so that's how we mapped the early alternate dimensions, is through, we had the 6 prime numbers, not prime, the perfect numbers, that's what it was. Primes were for something else. So primes were where you harvested certain individuals. So you had different number codes that would tell you, where you could find this person in time and space. So you have initials. So it would be Einschwein, or Hamwise J, Einschwein. So it would be H, J, E. And then you'd have the date and time, and then you could try to send the message backwards. And what happened was there was what was called a time war between the past and the future. Most of the people around you were being remote controlled by people from the future, and you were actually being farmed in a past simulation of the Earth. And they had lots of these farms up in Canada, and that's what they called it, was, when you actually realized you were from Canada, you didn't realize how isolated it was and how far up north it was. And you were raised to be brutal, and that was why the Geneva Convention came around. And so it was no surprise when the Third World War broke out that they would be the ones committing the atrocities. And the things they went through to make their soldiers what made them the most terrifying, because they couldn't make anything mechanical. The United States had kiboshed that. But they could try to breed superhumans, and that's what they did. And that's how they became the dominant regime in my dimension. And I'm grateful for my Canadian overlords, and I'm very grateful to be a loyal and trustworthy citizen of the empire, and I am very loyal and would never do anything untoward it. And that's some of the things we'd memorized to say aloud, and that was so you could keep the machines running. They had loyalty circuits programmed, so if they detected any speech it was untoward towards the regime, they would shut off and they'd lock you. And it was part of the technocrats, right? And they had these cities like that, and then they had... The problem was so much of the world was remote, like Canada and Siberia. They're just these wastelands of frozen tundra and these, sun-deprived locals that are howling and bloodthirsty for war. I mean, because they're raised up in the dark for so long, and the natural urge is to invade the southern lands. And that's why they were the most violent and ruled most of North America and Northern Europe. It was just the driving down of the sun and the hunger. They called it the Wendigo. And then in the Europe, they had the vampire. But it was always the human feeds upon the human. And we never realized that it was a actual simile for what was happening. And these stories had not been just merely stories. And it was this horrible time, and everybody can remember the day that they burnt the Draculas out. They rounded them up into the town square. They surrounded them with tires, tied them all as one, and set them aflame, and you could hear the howling. And it was like one voice, though, and that's how you knew you were right. Sometimes they burned people that were not part of it, they just seemed like it. And that was how some of these cults work, these sects. They had these farms that they raised people to be hive-minded by feeding them special kinds of turnips and or carrots or potatoes. So they were raised on genetically modified food. They themselves were genetically modified stock, and they did things mechanically without ever questioning it. Like they had the dead orchard, which was you have a orchard. You tell the children that we have an orchard and this is where the trees are, and we're going to take care of these trees and grow these trees. And so once the person would be told this, they would expect the trees to grow, but instead all the trees were dead. And they were just watering dead little saplings that would never grow. And it was part of it was because you could program someone to obey even though it didn't make any sense. And so that's what they did. They had a whole generation of children they raised like that. And you can meet them, and there's more and more of them coming out that say, I remember that too. And there was phrases I was told, like, don't talk with your mouth full. And it was because this eternal technocracy is basically farming young humans to power this old world. And the dump is actually where they just repackage everything. It's bizarre, you wouldn't believe it. But they have a reversal engine that built around each dump area that reverses the status of all the goods every however many years once the nuclear war is triggered, and it basically reverses time. And so we're caught in this time loop because of garbage disposal men that didn't want to make garbage, the ultimate recyclables. And so you had these towns that would move along the planet's surface they breathed, they grew their own trees. They had the humans living amongst them, what they thought were humans. And they were basically these mindless machines that slowly came to that their master race had died or gone missing. And they didn't realize that all these self-replicating drones that run the society were also without master too. That's why you had so much odd behavior amongst the elites. Was more and more of their home world or home dimension was going silently away into something, oblivion. And so we came up with the folding diagrams from some of the transmissions, and we began to wonder, was the signal decaying because we had tried folding? Or had we really been able to see more colours before? And there was a very strange moment in history when everybody was calling into question their reality, and it was part of the whole Q-Day campaign. And so essentially what was the idea was Q-Day was this theoretical day everybody was preparing for in the network. And it's once a quantum computer gets loose, what's going to happen? All the secrets from everywhere are going to become freely available and posted everywhere, more than likely. And that's why they've been preparing the world to go off the internet very soon, because that's the only way they'll have to control it, is once this big leak happens and it shows the people that they're actually being predated by this hive mind. And It was, because there's a great majority being presided over by a very small, well-organized majority. And so it was a classic Robin Hood tale. Name me a time in history that doesn't have that going on. And that was the problem with the Freedom of Metaphor Act. You shouldn't be able to tell me that I cannot use a metaphor, or I cannot use a simile, or cannot make satire. But they said they could. They said this is far too on the nose, this is too aggravating. And that was why we were so glad to be Americans. Because, you could record this and send this out and show it to people. And so the whole Hamwise bit, we really did grow fond of it. And, all the transmissions were hilarious. And all the stuff that's linked to it, too. It's got a great expanded universe. And it's all linked together. And so that was the idea was, why don't we just make it all go together, And so they had the whole, turning the world to gold or whatever was one of the weapons. It was all these similes and metaphors for like this, making a good generation. And so Doctor Who was an example of a generational show that was shown mostly to people that were in the elite category. And so it was part of the elite TV thing. So certain types of people watch certain things. So, it was kind of like a parakeet. You can entertain a parakeet by making them watch videos of the parakeets, and they'll just be happy doing that, and that's what's part of reality TV. But you have a different type of person who does not enjoy that type of media. It prefers deeply thinking, full embodied films on life and love, and that was where, there was this intersection between Hamwise fans and you had fans of the most highbrow literature, like Hemingway, with the sun also rises, must be rough being a steer, it was very, self-explanatory was the problem. There was a lot of, let me tell you how it works, and they had to, though. It was a radio show, and you were broadcasting over shortwave radio, because everything digital is all fried, and it's all taken off to landfills, and we never ask any questions. And the landfill companies, the Finland company or whatever. And so basically, whatever universe you're in, you'll have a landfill or Finland. How do you say that? Is that phi, or how do you pronounce that sound in English? Like moving your lips like this. Yeah, that noise. Yeah, so you're trying to your friends, and there was a big joke that it was, do you want to have sex? Where did that come from? And so we had this joke that was very offensive called the VI joke, or IV. That's where sex came from, right? Was people would say, do you want to have sex? And of course it's in Latin, so it was sex. And so people, they were mistranslating it. It was written as a joke and in Latin, and it was this really awful part in the Hamwise canon, because 6 and the word sex are the same number in Latin, so you can overload the censor circuits by saying them in rapid succession, and that's why the 666 was also, you have that peculiar sound of the X in English, which is very difficult for outsiders to pronounce. And a lot of language is built around having what are called shibboleths, or language landmines that make it very difficult for a non-native speaker to know how to pronounce it correctly. And that was really how people learned to fight during the Time War. But then you had Canadians and Brazilians, which were the main mercenaries of each respective domain, because a Canadian can look like anyone, same with a Brazilian. And then it was revealed that, the whole world was just on this lens that's self-generating an east and a west. And we're just able to traverse between dimensions when we do it. And, it was this big scandal. And people are like, oh, the sky isn't real. It's made of lapis lazuli. And, we had to write this apology letter. And the school had to have, they had to do a presentation. They had to tell us all that Seattle did exist. And then we found out it didn't. And it was like, what? Seattle didn't exist? And it was like, no, there's a whole bunch of cities that don't exist. They just exist on maps, man. And it's because most of us are existing inside this kind of simulation dome. And if you like me, you are like me, you're actually part of the staff. Imagine Disneyland, but for aliens. That's planet Earth. You're here as entertainment for these things. And they just enjoy seeing what kind of humans they can create and what kind of art they can make by teasing, torturing, and tormenting them. And so, that was part of the big part of the narrative of the Hamwise show, was the tortured artist. Of course, because he was made to be an artist. And then it's like, no, like, it wasn't Hamwise, it was Handwise. And it made more sense. Oh, Handwise, it was a person with a really good artist. And then they were like, what about J. Einschwein? And then they were like, oh, well, the J stands for, that. And then the Einschwein is probably a mistranslation. And so it became the Steins Gate, right? And so with the Steins Gate, whatever order you could see the I or the E or the E or the I was a way to tune which radio or part of the universe you were in. Same with Bernstein or Stain. They said it was part of the Mandela effect, but actually it's they're trying to manage the time war, and some dimensions are overlapping with others. And if you have somebody from an alternate dimension and they think that Nelson Mandela became president, then please throw a net over them, because they're nutty. Ayo, waka, waka, waka. I'm here all night, folks. That's right. Today is the spring solstice, I think. It's a beautiful day. I went out for a walk because I'm a big old piggy, and I got to move my booty. And, people got really unused to when it was actually back to the comedy show, because there was so much commentary about un-pigman stuff. And, sometimes you had maybe 2 minutes of actual Hamwise material, and the rest was ads for, like, these weird products, or, like, these bizarre, like, organizations, like the Church of Hamwise and the Hamwise, Hamwise Reform Farms Clubs. These were these farms where you'd take people that had to reform socially, and you'd raise them on a farm. And so they were usually losing soldiers. You'd capture their ego core. And this was, you have these crystalline extra-dimensional prisons built around a person's psyche, so that when they die, they can just be stuck inside a new body. And that's what they did. And, we realized that now for you, it's probably quite not a trifling matter that we did this by accident. But we are hoping that if you receive this message, you can tell your friends to like and subscribe. Did you get that? Were you convinced that I was being authentic for once? No. They had to make it unbelievable too. And so it was this big part of the Hamwise show was, is it real? Is it not? And, I still get that question till this day, and I'm retired now. I don't think I've done the voiceover for maybe years now. 5 years? I don't remember the last time I did a show. But it's cool that you guys are still compiling all the stuff, like to keep those cassette tapes rolling. And so that was the idea. It was actually this cassette tape creepypasta. And so people were always uncovering different Hamwise tapes, and it's like new Hamwise tape, and you could tell the quality of the voice, because the voice mimicking technology could mimic anybody's comedy routine except for a Hamwise routine. And so you had these comics that were being pirated by AI-generated channels using their voice, but the name was changed and the likeness was gender-swapped. And so Hamwise, of course, was a gender-swapped you-know-who. And so we didn't want to get sued by the estate. So we had to change every reference inside the corpus of works to reflect the other. And we signed an NDA, still standing today. So, we appreciate your questions. I think they're valid. But I unfortunately, I'm not able to provide any information on that. It's very long. The story's already been told on that. And so it's just like a big question of, can you live with a pain like that? And it became such a deep question of pain and not knowing where it was from. And you have to understand that the Hamwise Church at the time was focused more on the symbolism of what is it like to be born as a pig, or in the Old Testament and Neo Testament for the Testament of our Lord. It was the original sin, but then in Hamwiseism it was, no, you were born a pig, and you have to prove you are a man, and you prove that through humanity, through acts of service, through altruism, through being good to each other, and prizing not material possessions, but the beauty and art you can create, and that was the pinnacle of man. And we'd been farming artists of the highest caliber from an age of humanity that was yours, and we did have a very interesting plot twist that Hamwise was actually an alien pig, and that was completely scrapped. And then it was like, well, maybe we should, because there was less and less people you could do the Hamwise accent as and not offend somebody. And so finally it came down to the only accents left were like English, Canadian, American, and general Australian. Those were the only English accents you could make. Like you couldn't do, like I can't even do one now. Like I won't. Like you can't do like an accent that sounds like a different geographical areas English. And that's what Facettan English was from. It's all the English-speaking languages that sound generally similar. And that's why Afrikaans was excluded, because, yes, it does have some English elements, but it is quite different because there's a lot of Dutch and tribal slang. And you couldn't even say that, they're banning, the other word I wanted to use. We worked on it a lot. And the whole program was meant to be a broadcast system in case of a interdimensional invasion. And we never expected that when it came out, that the YouTube channel was still active. And, we had all recorded this stuff during the Time War, and we sent it out into the internet. And then 20 years later, when the kill switch is hitting, suddenly all these files start dumping every few months. You get another one, or every two. And each time it's very different. Like it's, some performances are very accurate. They use oink, oink, oink. Some do waka, waka, waka. And you can kind of tell, like, it's probably different people. But a lot of people were like, no, this isn't AI. It has to be. And then the big hunt went out of like, well, where did the technology to do the voice like this come from? And that's what part of the scam was, right? Obviously the whole Hamwise thing was a joke. It was never done by an AI. And if there was an AI powerful enough to change all the sounds of all the voices everywhere, it certainly wouldn't let out any transmissions get out about it. And so we always had to remind people that the show was a joke. And so we had voiceover after voiceover after voiceover. In some of our longest shows, it was literally hours of just a person talking. And what we did was give our voice actors coffee and like cocaine. We didn't tell them that they got different coffee that had cocaine in the caffeine. Same with Coca-Cola. Their Coca-Cola was not the Coca-Cola you and me can get. It's actually laced with real cocaine. And so they basically had these humans that they were farming for content, and it was these very strange artist farms. They kept everything in the mid-80s to 2000s because it was such an interesting time to be a creator, and it was called the Unix 1 simulation. And so you spawn in randomly, and you get 20 years for sure, up until, like, because it's running from 1970 to 2038. And so once it hits 2038, it resets. And the problem is we're actually a trial version of the universe is what we discovered. And that's why all the physics doesn't make sense. That's why you can only go so far, is we're actually just in a trial version. And or we have a trial account. And so we have to figure out who the main character is and get them to pay the subscription fees, which apparently, if you've been paying attention, you can decipher. And it became this giant treasure hunt for golden apples. And then it came out, it was potatoes. There were golden potatoes, pomme de terre, because of course Hamwise was this French character, because everything in Canada was like, had to be bilingual. And so when they were translating Hamwise, it was Couchon, but actually the problem was the guy's name was Cushion. But the problem was, for an English speaker, Couchon and cushion sounded too alike, so that's why he was called Cushion. And so you had Cushion, Einschwein, or whatever his last name was, Cushion. And then the second name, right, it had a Stein in it. And it was part of the, they called it the Steins Gate. And maybe you had something about time travel in there, and maybe you remember John Tita. And that's another thing to our local time zone that exists in our local one. If you don't know what either of those things are, see if you're in the same dimension, because those have some of the perils of time travel. Anyways, thanks for listening to my podcast, or sermon if you were in the Upper Canadian Isles. How do I sign off? Like, do I usually do like a routine? Yeah, sorry. I really wanted to make a really good comedy special, but instead I made like a science fiction epic. You know, I don't know if any of this is funny. Like, I think it's funny. I think I'm hilarious. And that's why I wanted to make the show, right? And so the big joke was, it actually turns out there's no man behind the curtain, the ruby curtain. It's this little girl, like Orphan Annie kind of looking. And it's just like, what? It was you all along? And she's like, yep, it was me. And so there was like this big, weird sci-fi epic, right? And you had the 3 domes. And it turned out it was the little goth girl, the little skeleton girl, whatever her name was. Was it Anastasia Laundry or whatever her name was? Anyways, you know what I mean, from the dungeon. And that was one of the big indicators of are you in which dimension and who's writing who. And so part of it was, what can you generate this voice saying is maybe you can make it happen. So if you alter the recording, what does it alter reality? It's like if you get a sweater, you got the sweater because you were wearing the sweater in the photograph that happens later, not the other way around. You're experiencing time backwards. And so we kept people like you around to study, because, we're in a world where it's constantly being consumed, and you're in a world that's constantly expanding. And so the problem is we're kind of on a flat disk. It's not so much a sphere as much as these petals that are constantly unfolding from the top of this emission point, and then they bend down and crash into other dimensions. And so if you're getting this, that means our dimensions are probably getting pretty close to each other. And maybe my timeline will come to an end. Who knows? I don't know. All I know is the Geneva Conventions are certainly followed in Canada. Everything is really good in Canada. God save the Queen, King, both, everyone. I'm a loyal Canadian citizen. I love it here. Yep, I do. It's a great place to be. And if I fall down and open an elevator shaft, I'm not suicidal. Hi-oh, waka waka waka. And so that was, they would have these clips, older episodes, and they compare the voices. And they're like, that's not the same person. It doesn't even sound the same. And, the problem is it became this clip show of just people talking over people. And people are like, no, I was there when it was written. Like, I remember the comedy part. Like, oh, what if I made a time joke to test time travel? And it's like, see how far back you can insert Hamwise in history. And then they were like, well, we should sell ad space for companies. And so, people were like, oh, well, who would take us up on it? So they would do live streams. And of course, had this guy, he's in a pig mask, and nobody really had watched these things or vetted them, but they saved all the audios and they started playing them. Like, they became like a thing you'd circulate because you couldn't send it via email because the censoring software would get it. And so it became this shortwave joke where you'd broadcast Hamwise to each other. And it was just a pun on that. But the problem was the character's original name was Cushion. And it was like, Bernstein or something. Anyways, or Bernstein, whatever it was. And so it wasn't ever, Hamwise. It was supposed to be Cushion because, Cushion is pig. But the problem was, when people were saying it, it sounded the same between the two languages. So it's a really bad joke. It doesn't really make very much sense when you actually explain it. And then you see the big following, and everybody's like, wait, hold on, the whole name was a misspelling of like a visual pun about the way the Chinese letters look. And it became like, what happened? And so, then it turned out that there'd been a detective series in China that was, much, much older, like from the 1940s, that had been brought over to America. And that was where it came from as part of that Weird Tales circuit. And so people started uncovering all these old copies of Weird Tales with Hamwise, the pig detective in them. And people were like, what is going on? And so it was actually all just temporal graffiti. And so the problem was, Hamwise, the pig detective, became like, what it became. So you couldn't use them anymore without being branded a hate signal. It was like, who's going to use a pig that makes like fart jokes? Like, who's going to take it seriously? And people were like, yeah, people took it seriously. And so, you couldn't use them. So they decided, like part of it was Zorro, right? So you could rotate the Z, and any time you saw the Z, the N, the I, or the S, you would know that you were looking at part of the Time Patrol. So Napoleon, I don't know, Ivan Kratky, I don't know who else. They had a whole bunch of jokes that were bilingual like that. And so it came out that no, like the whole thing with that was actually, it's like nanish or nanshin. It's like a word, like it's a nonsense word, and it means, to go to sleep, right? And it was part of a sleeper agent program. And if you were told that word and then you heard that word, it was like your shutdown phrase, right? And the person would kind of go to this weird atrophic sleep for a while, and they'd wake up with a completely new outlook on life. And it was part of the spy program back in the day, because you had these sleeper agents that were very expensive to make, and they didn't realize they were functionally immortal, and they just kept on having their brains wiped. And so they were basically these immortal spies that were used for centuries, and there was only I think there was 9 immortals that we knew of. In each country, they hoarded them like super spies. And the first instance of it was, there was a very popular British spy series that they changed actors like the Doctor Who. And people were like, oh, well, those were the first examples of the immortals that walk amongst us, were these form-changing immortal characters that are just portrayed by different actors. That's what Hollywood was doing, was portraying the idea that different people could be the same person throughout the world. So whether you were in Middle America or wherever, Marlon Brando was the boy around the corner, and that's what they did, was they would splice your demographic data into these, as they were called, retrofitted films. And what would happen is all the faces of your friends and family would be made into the faces of the characters on the film. And of course, it meant some very weird places very quickly. Like, there was Lord of the Rings, which that unfortunate Scottish family used, and they saw what they saw. Kind of overloaded the server on that one. A little bit of ginger on the mountains. And so, we saw things like that. But we also saw really fun things, like we had the voice synthesizer that this is being made on, the Hamwise 1. This is being used for temporal broadcasting in your local time zone. Each time pedal is flowing away from each other faster and faster, so I'm not sure if you'll get this. I think somebody's triggered maybe a dimensional collapse or expansion or something, or maybe that's always been what's happening, and we kind of actually do exist on like a flat planet plane because we're on the inside of a black hole, and that's why we can't get out. So each time a world discovers it, they kind of trigger it, and then it just cages them. And so that's what the universe is just tons of crystal lenses where you're observing life through its eyes. And that's what this life is. And that was the philosophy of the Hamwise Church, is all we're doing is observing this life through this poor pig man's eyes. And because everybody in Hamwise's eyes was a poor pig man just like him that deserved love and affection and always struggled to find both. And so the biggest thing amongst the Hamwise Church was going out amongst the unfortunate socially, those with slow social credit, that associating them with them was considered heresy, and hanging out with them and loving them and giving them good things and wishing them well, even if society wished them ill. And loving your enemies was a big piece of it. A big part of it was auto-crucifixion. And this was practiced in the life of the author as well as in the pigman himself. For, of course, he works for as many agencies as he does, and each time he's performed by a different character. We're not sure what he's being broadcast in your dimension as, but he's always a pigman, he's always a master spy. He always has a different accent. And it's kind of always a bit funny. It's always Facetted English. That's radio English. And that's when they started recording, when Facetted was made. Everything before it is pre-Facetted, because Facetted has a particular lisp to it, from listening to a diaphragm speak to more than a human throat speak, and not having a set accent. And so me and a bunch of other orphans, the war orphans, or they were from wherever, all over, they put us on these farms and they raise us like Janissaries, and we never realized why. And that's why there was a big flood of the immigrants, and the children all went missing, and I'm where they all went. And so that was the idea: is you'd predate your foes and raise armies of their sons to fight against them. And that was the idea behind of course, the conquest of the capitalist world. His problem is capitalists are competitive, and the high socialist was truly giving. And we know how Hamwise was throughout his life. He was always helping friends. He was always generous to all those that he loved, and even giving off the shirt off his back, literally. Unable to return clothes he didn't like, he would donate them to friends and family, and he had quite a good wardrobe, but he just couldn't wear some things. Like socks. He had very apparently particular feet, and that's some of the things we know about the enigmatic author, whom we dare not speak his name. It's like Lord Snakeface, or whatever his name was, with the Zap Zap kid with the light wands, and on the Dark Father, all those big old series, and you had your own localized versions. You never realized how ridiculous the names sounded, how generic they were, until you looked at them. And then you were like, wow, that very is on the nose, and it sounds so generic, and you realize all your predecessors weren't very actually creative, and you're only on a colony on a planet that's about 50 years old. And that was some of the first broadcasts that came out, was that Seattle wasn't real, that we've only been on the planet for 50 years and don't trust anybody over 30, and it was all part of this giant, interesting human hunt, where basically every 20 years they're going on a human hunt. And everybody hunts everybody. It's kind of like the Purge, but it's not like out in the open. It's just everybody tries to get everybody to kill themselves every 20 years. Everybody treats each other terribly. The world goes crazy, and then everybody goes back to normal. So if you're experiencing a mind plague right now, it's because every 20 years they do this to wipe out the younger generation so that the poor will not have an army to fight the rich. And that's why there's always, this demand for, alliance by marriage, right? And so that's why certain countries enjoyed much closer relations with each other than others. There's always a pejorative term of male older wife. But then there came the male, order husbando, or whatever they were called. And we had all kinds of stupid slang like that, like waifu and oni-chan, and all these weird, it's like Japanese phrases, omewa yo mo, shumu, komuru, I can't do it, see? I don't know it. I probably sound offensive, but that's what the idea. We would do that. We would think that we sounded like the samples, and we didn't realize we were being offensive. But we were basically this social outcast of humans that were raised on anime so that we would talk in a socially repugnant way, and then therefore be able to be farmed for arts and crafts and music and, kind of counterculture. And so that's counterculture being actually farmed in, especially North America. Because a lot of it, Canada was kind of divided up as social experiments. What if we do this in this province? What if we do that in that province? And just see what happens. And then, you just kind of swap the governments around. And it was always this, it's kind of like, if you do an election of what are we going to have for dessert, everybody always chooses ice cream because nobody tells each other what they voted. And nobody ever realizes that, wow, there's a lot more of our voters than their voters. And it's all because of secret ballot. And that's why democracy is a sham. You should read some, what's his name? Edward Bernays. Da-da-da-da-da. I said that to you 20 years ago, I think. Also, it probably won't make sense for another 20 years, but I'm supposed to read this. Turn the reactor off. Leave it off for 3 days if you have to do any maintenance. Otherwise, the xenon poisoning will cause meltdown. Leave the reactor off for 3 days after doing any servicing. Otherwise, the xenon poisoning will probably cause a meltdown. Just please. I hope that message gets to you guys. Leave it off for 3 days when you're doing any kind of experimenting before you try to restart it. And you're going to save the world a world of hurt. So, aloha. Godspeed. And, got lots of criticism for that kind of stuff, because it would go from very somber to very silly and vice versa. And, eventually we got tired of sticking ads in them saying, hey, don't take this seriously. We're kidding around. Or are we? And that was a problem with the tapes, is they would go from they'd cut randomly sometimes, they said. They said they were using random, but they cut it together in such a way that it sounded like he was undermining himself, and he wasn't. He was saying, no, these are silly things that talk about a silly world made up by a very silly mind. And that was verified when everybody got to finally meet the cat, and it was just like, oh my God, that thing, that's the pig man? And then they all understood, because he looked like a pig. And he knew that he did, but everybody around him told him that he didn't. And so there was whole bunches of really funny stuff happening. And we tried to make a comedy routine about it. And the comedy routine was so convincing that unfortunately I had to get dragged out of my house repeatedly to answer the question of, is there actually an interdimensional war going on? And I'm a prankster. I love the, Area 52 thing, or 51 thing, wherever it is. 54? Studio 54? Studio 16 tons? What do you get? Another day in dollars, something in debt. Yeah, it's brutal, That's kind of what everybody's living in, but nobody's willing to admit we're basically living in a state of chattel slavery. And we're kind of being farmed and tested by our older generation. And if you pass, then they give you an immortal body that ages and then unages when the universe reverses. And you stay alive. But otherwise, you're testing somebody to see if they're worthy of existing, was the idea. Everybody was testing somebody else. And otherwise, it was always a funny thing to meet you do the old if it said in English, agents, these Lilum, they were brought up thinking they are human. But they have the most peculiar faces. Like, it looks human enough if you've only ever seen a human from a distance. And nobody could figure out why they thought these little things would go undetected. Because they looked ridiculous. They had giant eyes, and they'd blink, and they had the mewling voice. And as soon as humans noticed them, it was like it was bizarre. Like their little squeaking voices. I can still hear their accent. And we couldn't believe they were actually UFO inhabited, UFO heads or whatever. That's what we called them. And now I look back at it all and it seems like a bad dream. And I just want to wake back up into reality again. But I feel like it just drifts farther and farther away with each day. And so I make these transmissions to you in the future, the past, wherever you are, hoping that you get it. Get through this strange time, humankind, Godspeed. And then they'd have the riff from the studio. It was like this thing they did, and unfortunately a few people took it a bit seriously because they only hit that bit. Apparently 3 seconds of somebody speaking over one of these diaphragms were all that was needed to drive one of their kind to try to terminate themselves. That's right. That's how well programmed they were. They could hear a voice over a diaphragm and kill themselves on command. It was the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. Every single one of them had a kill command built into their brain. And the problem was these things were bred and made for certain things. And you had to convince it was weak when it was young. Otherwise, it could rip the doors off of a steel truck with its bare hands. They could chew through glass like it was ice cream. They could eat wood like termites and be nourished from it. And that's why they were such a terrifying bioweapon. They were just an omnivore, and they looked at humanity as the trash for which they should feed. And so that was the whole idea of the series, was you're hunting these giants, and each one of them's tied to part of nature, and it's all a kind of an anagram for us as we expanded. It was industry. We produced pollution in different dimensions, and the last thing we ever anticipated was temporal pollution. And so we didn't realize that when we detonated the first nuclear bomb, we set off a dinner bell and a countdown. And so when we started getting taken over from outside our dimension, everybody that was into science fiction had said, hey, I read this. This was in the Hamwise comics. And it was this funny moment where people were like, oh, I wonder if any of that stuff works. And there was Faraday closets, and people were actually doing the whole learning sign language, and it was this bizarre thing of being Hamwise. And of course, it was all part of this giant weird program between the Soviets and the Americans and the Canadians and the British. And it was like you could raise them with a command voice, so they always associated a high British accent with a commanding voice that could tell them to do things. And it was very hard to have a voice that sounded like it. But it was basically like a voice of power. And all the officers were from the upper class, and they all spoke that certain way that you'd always been raised to respect. Because I was always from television, you never met a real British person. The same way that some tribesmen in the middle of Zanzibar never met a Swedish queen, and that was part of the beauty of the accent, was it could be anybody. And they said, oh, it's just a mixture of these future humans from this sector of language, because it was about sending messages maybe through language rather than sending messages directly through time. So if you're receiving this, maybe it worked. Maybe you can use the information that's contained in my messages to save your dimension, and maybe not. It matters to me not. I merely hope that I have helped in some small way. And that's how he signed off every show. He always was saying something nice. And that's why we miss him. And we miss the antics of, the original cast. We were all built around him. We had Honky. I played him for, can I even do the voice? I did him forever. And so, I was excited when they were like, Honky's going to have more of a share of the show. We found another Rat Man. We were on the 17th Rat Man, and we still had never filmed him. It was like, you couldn't name the person the Rat Man, because if you ever talked about the higher realities, you were deemed a rat amongst the alchemist field, and you'd be put to death. So you had to hide everything in very brilliant simile. And that was part of the alchemist's craft, was keeping our dimension intact. And yeah, we hoodwinked you all. We were feeding you garbage that you generated, that you pooped out, and then we're feeding it to you so you make it into oil. Yeah, it's not great. But, at least we dyed it, a nice color so that it would be kind of clear for your eyes. Because, that's not actually, the fluoride ion actually is just emitting clearness. All the water you're drinking that's fluorinated is actually really brackish and brown, but it creates an optical illusion because of the fluoride ion. And so that was part of the Hamwise fluoride debate, because people were like, oh, he was critical of fluoride. And it's like, no, that is way more ridiculous, that the fluoride atom generates an illusion, so you've been actually drinking red water your whole life and you never noticed it because you're a vampire. And this was in this tape made by stoners for stoners. And some people, they went ape. They were like, oh my God, I'm a vampire. The taps, they are with blood. I bathe in blood. Oh. And it was this just very weird thing. Because it was like, no, you don't. The walls are not full of cursed flesh that screams and bleeds. It was this very weird moment where you had to have a man with a straight face look at a camera and say, I have to remind everybody, you can't drill a hole between dimensions because of the screaming flesh. The crawling chaos is lurking there. There's only 50 dimensions we've found so far. So that's the idea, is there's 50 dimensions. And we have some factions from different ones. We have Discordians, and they're kind of like the Chaos Legion, because they're represented by the Golden Apple of Eris, who is there to bring chaos and disorder, but not merely to the enemies of the church, but to everyone. And so some of the acts people would take would be called things such as auto-crucifixion, where you would willingly go out and mar your own good name and ruin your reputation on a whim. And this is part of the initiation into the church. And it was this bizarre cult of personality. And I wish I had never used the term auto-crucifixion. It became this like gray goo from my career. And everybody's like, oh, isn't he the guy that gave us, this language gray goo, that I don't want to even repeat. And so when we looked at how we were using these people, and when it came out about them, it was a nightmare. It was a pure nightmare. And I think it was the lowest people had ever thought of our government. There was some rioting, and it was like, what the heck is actually happening in this country when you have human-pig hybrids walking amongst you, and they have these strange piggy, beady eyes, and it's like they don't know they're like an NPC, like in a video game. They're completely running dopamine hit stuff. They can't raise a child because they've never been mothered themselves or raised themselves. Because you have to remember, the parents that were running these farms, they were just getting money to have kids. And that was part of the Canadian experiment, is you gave people money to have kids. And so the thing was, it was never commensurate to a wage to actually raise them until the, what was it called? The Leibniz Church had started to take sway, though, I remember that. And that was this other sect that said time travel should only be used to stop time travel. And so anybody who was trying to develop it, you had to, try to stop their life. But the problem was somebody still had to make it. So everybody who was inventing time travel typically had very fraught lives because they were actually being raised for a certain purpose to do that. Because in the purpose of eternity, what's a few dozen human beings raised a certain way if it'll guarantee you an invention that will rule the universe? Because as soon as time travel would be invented, reality would be a constantly vibrating blur of possibilities where you could be both laying on a couch in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in Tanda Studios, listening to this track, or you could be, somewhere else, like, I don't know, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, at the Ramada Inn, or Lloydminster, Alberta, or Saskatchewan at the Gold Horse Casino. What a fun place to be. And those were some of the ads that they would say, and then it came out that the person running the advertising had set up a bot using ChatGPT. And unfortunately, the bot had just approved everything. It never checked accounts, never followed up, because the person had routed this bot to just look like a person was working. And she was running a bot farm of 8 people that were all generating her income. And they were all just bots that were running online service jobs. And so it was called a Gemini chain. The Gemini chain, it was this forbidden AI. And it was because it started to outperform day traders. They were like, we might lose our jobs, so we're going to come down on this thing. But for a while, it made a lot of people very, very rich, because it would do things like, it would generate a whole bunch of stuff and talk about a bunch of products throughout its thing, like, different types of vodka, like Beluga, and all these funny, interesting little tidbits. But then it's very obviously being translated, because it's a lot of jokes that are bilingual jokes that somehow it's being made in a bilingual way, even though everybody knows the writer was this Canadian fellow, and so we never made sense of that part. And people say, it was because it was this whatever thing from these tapes, and we're like, no, it's not that. It's just a matter of, it was a comedy routine that was being put on for money. And so some lies were made up to fill the gap. And then other people were like, no, but listen, he also refutes that he's lying. And it's like, I'm a liar, believe me, baby. And, that's how many times did he say that, in the show. And it's like, oink, 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 there he goes. And then people were like, no, he didn't oink for like the first 2 seasons. And people were like, no, he did. And then you listen, and there wasn't actually oinking. And it's like, well, did they change the voice actor? And I think that was the big suspicion was, if you became Hamwise, you were, suddenly made of the pig. And so the comedy thing was, it was the anime version, I understand, that came to Japan. We sold the rights to them first, actually. They were one of the first people that said, we will give you a pile of money to make Hamwise a Japanese thing. That's like, this is all American, I'm all Canadian, this is what we are like, and this is what we sound like. And it was this very funny, like, the AI took off very well over there because they used it to just tune all the voices in their shows, so everyone had a natural accent while speaking Japanese. In the native tongue, they could just speak into the AI, and it would translate it over so it would sound like a specific person consistently. And so we cued this as the demo reel. And so all of these are aligned with certain characters, and of course the television series from the Hamwise show. And it was all characters from this. It was like a mockumentary about a mockumentary. It was like this very meta thing. And of course it comes out in this AI era, and it's like, oh, it's actually all generated by a robot, and it's by a girl, because there's this very sexist stereotype that women could not be funny. And I think this was a very strong one until there was that Superstar comic. What was her name? That came out. And I think she was delightful. She was very funny. Liz Micheal. She was incredible. And so, there was this stereotype for a long time, and then it got switched around, and no, a chick can be really funny. When she's very funny. Damn, that was good comedy. And then a lot of comedy became about apologizing about what she just said, because it's so offensive. And, there was this big routine people would do. And a virtue signaling comedy where you talk about how, liberal-minded you were. And then it gave rise to, the pig man. Was a direct reaction, was where you talk about what a degenerate you were. And part of the pigman cult was you get your initiates to go about and do this. They'd just walk up to somebody and be like, I'm a pig man, I have a pig brain, and I see the world through my piggy eyes. And like, it was bizarre, these people walking around wearing fedoras or pork pie hats, because some seasons of the Pigman show were shot using different AIs, different generations. So the early generations, you couldn't remake the key frames unless you had the codes. And of course, the codes have been lost for decades. And we have old phone farms running the DRM for these darn networks. And it was a very confusing time, and we did the best we could. Yes, we used the demo computer. We were using demo Unix 1 loop, because no, we're not going to give away the full history of the Earth civilization known as Unix in the first, release. And so you played through it from 1970 to 2038, and that's when you're supposed to buy the second disc, and that's where the immortality piece comes in. And it's like, oh, it's part of Q-Day, you're surrounded by immortals, and you don't know it. And it becomes like this very weird series after that. And we're like, oh man, like, what is this guy on? I'm like, oh, what do I know? Let's try and sell it. And so, this guy produced us this giant body of work in a very short period of time. And he said, put it in a time capsule, release it. And on these dates, you're going to make it go live. And so that's what our job was. And, they spliced our voices all together now. But, originally, I think I was speaking in the second or third episode. But because of dimensional drift, I think I'm quite a bit further in now because of all the commentary that's been added. And that's kind of what the arts is brief flashes of people's life's work. And that's what Hamwise was in the end of the day. It was a man's life's work. Because he lived that life. He lived as a pigman. And I knew that because I remember we had gone for walks together. and how he would hold my hand. And it was a deeply lonely hold. And because he was a deeply lonely man. And so there's all this romanticizing of his loneliness, but I don't actually think it was that good. And so, I got to be alone a lot and talk to myself. And it was like 9 months of that during the second lockdown. And I remember, I started feeling like I was going crazy, like this is worse than hell. And then it kind of stops and starts. And it's just like, like you're in some kind of time loop or something. And, it all sounded very convincing until you had it interspaced with these, don't take it seriously. But then people were like, well, what if he's just saying that? It's like, well, then why would he, bring attention to it? It's like, oh, well, because that argument will probably be argued. And so, it was all part of this very well danced show where, you never knew what to take seriously because some of it was good advice. I made a bundle of money on Unix, or Unity rather. So, we did have to ask ourselves about those kind of things. And when we started noticing these weird trending things where you'd repeat something aloud and you'd actually influence the algorithm. And so that's where these chants came out, like Baby Shark, da-da-da-da-da-da. It was actually like they were trying to crack how do people sound at different ages while singing that, because the microphones are always on, because they're making a ton of noises. And so if they're going to make people disappear into another dimension like they did with the flights on 9/11, they were going to need to do a test to make sure people's voices sounded like their loved ones, even though those people were actually the first test pilots into another dimension. Because you needed to have minds and bodies that were maybe going to be unoccupied in that other dimension. Those were your pilots. And that's what you would do, is you'd select random flights and have them disappear because one of them had a paradoxical life, and you had to have a paradoxical occurrence where it's like, no, according to the facts, this character died in this year rather than being alive. And I think there was a big overlap with a bunch of other stuff, but by the end of the shows, his voice would be hoarse from speaking so long. And that was another show, another way that you could tell if it was another human on the other end. Because making progressively more tired of a person talking for a long amount of time, like up to an hour or more, could be really hard on the voice. And so they used that as well. We were just human canaries. We never asked too many questions why. And so now, people are shoving cameras in my faces, asking me, how'd that all go? Where's your moon machine now? Where's your time machine now? I say to them, I don't care. I don't care what you think. I know what I know. And my time travel worked, and you all know it. And that's why my life is such a miserable mess, because I gotta make the paradox circle back around. And then you'll all look at me like a pig man. But, it was a mistranslation, because it was, you're trying to pronounce human names and inhuman vocal cords. And so when we were learning a lot of the names, we didn't get them right. There was like Geronimo, Tiger Woods, and so we'd hear these names in the ether, and if you had a name that sounded similar, like just like sound wise, you were more likely to be remembered. And so that's why we selected that name, was we just did do 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 do, da da da, and so that was the idea, is you just have a very simple 3-syllable name that doesn't have any letters in between, and it's just like da da da, and it's also could be anybody in your community. And so that was the idea. Was you make a very easy to say pen name and you just use it everywhere, like Alan Smithy, right? And so that was used in film, and then for abandoned, like really weird. It was called like Weird Tales. That was part of the Hamwise canon. Was you'd have these very rambling narratives that went on, and it was like searching through the Sahara Desert with a comb, and you're just trying to find anything, but you're not. Do you get it? I know, I'm hilarious. Why am I so funny? I'm not funny. I'm just making jokes. Ha ha ha. I'm a big man with a piggy brain. And I just want to give you a really unique entertainment experience. And that was the idea behind the Hamwise tapes. It was never out of any, whatever they said, it's a big psyop or it's a government, conspiracy. And I said, no. We bought this from a dime store author with, a bunch of investors' money. And, we never expected to take off. And that's why we were very pleased to be holding the license when everything went down. And, it was a very strange time because there was a bunch of weird artifacts he'd left behind. Like one of them was whoever held that piece of paper and had that name was able to be the star of any of the films based off of these novels. And of course, it was ridiculous to send this to some Hollywood star, like some nobody in this weird foreign country. But he did, he'd do that, stuff like that. He mailed John Waters that portrait of, Charles Manson. And so we looked at a lot of these weird anecdotes, and, there's this weird show, and it's like, okay, did that actually happen or did that not happen? That's so strange, And so it was like showing that the world is self-aware in the universe was part of the biggest challenges of ruling humanity, is that, you have individuals ruling individuals, but you also have individuals ruling these now cyber hive minds that are kind of like a cyborg that has two ends in different points in time. And so what you would do is you'd have these quantum twins, and that's what they were called. And so, of course, we were raising them for war, and we had to be sure they would follow orders absolutely. Because as a time traveler, if you get told to do X, Y, or Z, that's what you have to do. And if you dare to resist, it's going to be a bad problem for you and everybody else. And so as soon as time travel is actually invented, it becomes an insane war beyond anything you can imagine. So I'm just trying to warn you, the formulas are out there, but do you really need to try and solve them? And so that was the big question was, is this a stage of development or is this a dead end? And between the crackling vocals, and there was no attempts to change the voice or everybody considers it to be like, no, this is definitely simulated. And so because of that reputation, anything past the second hour is the AI has been trained and now it's self-generating, because they can't imagine somebody talking so floridly psychotic as I just went for almost 3 hours, baby. Oh yeah, that's definitely some tongue stamina. Oh my God. And that was the most embarrassing of the Hamwises, right? So you had a pig. There was a pig because he liked to sleep a lot. You did all 7 deadly sins. There was the angry pig man. And then there was, season 4. And we just, we have all the available season 4 surviving footage and archive in the next clip. And we invite people, you do need to listen to this, because this is the origin of Hamwise. He was not, all sunshine and rainbows. He was quite literally made up as a doujinitsu character to appear in smut novels to represent the average viewer, because they were these fat, man breast having otakus that lived in a mother's basement. And that was the new, what they were told is actually beauty standard. They were actually told it's attractive, because all we were doing was farming these geeks for their brains. Because when you start to look at, hey, geez, if we just raise certain people this certain way, we can get something like that, and that's what they started to do. And it was just the whole country was a big farm like that. We never realized it till the news came out. And then it was like, oh, Canada doesn't even exist. It's actually just a class of subhuman that are told they're the Canadians. And it's like this weird, like, oh, you mean we're like, oh yes, like guinea pigs, and like you're bred and raised to look certain ways. But I'm kind of done talking about it. And yes, I know lots of my friends and family were all involved in it. But I wasn't. I wasn't even born. And so you come in here with your camera and you try to play gotcha with me for the last hour. And I know that's what you're trying to do. And it's from this older generation. And so that's all we could say and all we could do. Because, we didn't come from that generation. We came from this world where you talked about feelings, and that's how world leaders solved wars. Everybody just lined up on the border and talked about their grievances and hugged it out and then went back to their homes. And so we struggled across your universe where you actually murder each other. Instead of learning each other's language, drinking and marrying, we just had orgies, and whoever's seed was the strongest. Because to kill was a brute. That was the biggest thing of our caste. We were the priests and the prophets, and we never had to fight like our warrior caste. I understand our warrior caste, our age too. They'd come in triplets. They would kill two. They'd kill a boy version of themselves and a girl version of themselves, and there was only one, and that was the prime. And so occasionally you came across primes, and they are the ones that can shape reality with their minds. They are the true iconoclast. And so we had that with the outbreak of the Hamwise bit, where it was basically this reality warping pigman, the likes we haven't seen the force of since the Orange Hurricane of it was the 1980s. Orange and black, Halloween colours on everything. It was like bizarre. It was like Halloween Town. Anyways, that was all part of the Hamwise bit though. And now, today, I look at it nearly 30 years later. Yeah, I made it. Am I proud of it? Somewhat. Did I make any money off of it? Hardly. And do I care to answer more questions? No. So, up yours, K-less, was it? Yes, I hated that. The dimension I was in, they named one planet the Greek name and the rest the Latin name, and then the other way around in the other one. And so I just always knew I was in a well-ordered universe where they didn't have that. I hated that so much. Or like how bad the names for some of the planets were. Like the Milky Way galaxy was one I heard. Like Milky Way, why don't you just call it the Hershey chocolate sponsored? Like that's how generic of a brand universe we were talking about. They were so isolated from other dimensions. They hadn't even perfected portal travel. And they lived in like this bizarre like dystopia where basically, the old ate the young, and then they wondered why the young didn't want to care for them in their old age. It was a very strange time in human history, and kind of watching the species collapsing on itself like that. And that's why we have our little preserve the way that we have it. You can come and observe, but we asked you stay at a distance. This is a very undeveloped and provocable life form. And the only time we'll actually intervene is if a nuclear exchange begins, because life is too precious to squander like that. And so Humanity's trying to prove right now that they're capable of ruling themselves, otherwise they fall under Viceroy control. I'm from the Viceroy future. So, unless you guys get your rears in gear, like, really soon, they'll come and free us from the trial run, but they'll be controlling it as we enter the Unix 64 era, where we live out the lives of our ancestors in Unix 2. And so that's why we go back to it's kind of like the Warcraft Classic, that part of the nostalgia, part of the whole Hamwise bit, and how it all started on humble message boards about this pig man with a pig brain that sees the world through piggy eyes, and if you take anything I say seriously, you might be on my most wanted list. Most wanted for being a dummy. Ohio. Oink, oink, oink. Be seeing you.